Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. Read by Robbie Coltrane. I will begin the story of my adventures with a certain morning in the month of June, the year of grace 1751, when I took the key for the last time out of the door of my father's house. By the time I had come as far as the manse, the mist that hung round the valley at dawn was beginning to arise and die away. Mr. Campbell, the minister of Essendine, was waiting for me by the garden gate. "Well, Davy lad," said he, "I will go with you as far as the ford to set you on your way." And we began to walk forward in silence. "Are you sorry to leave Essendine?" said he, after a while. "Why, sir," said I, "Essendine is a good place, but to speak the truth, if I thought I had a chance to better myself where I was going, I would go with a good will." "Aye," said Mr. Campbell, "then it behoves me to tell you your fortune, or so far as I may. When your mother was gone, and your father, the worthy Christian man, began to sicken for his end, he gave me a certain letter, which he said was your inheritance. 'So soon,' says he, 'as I am gone, give my boy this letter, and start him off to the house of Shaws, not far from Cramond. That is the place I came from.'" "The house of Shaws!" I cried. "What had my poor father to do with the house of Shaws?" "Nay, who can tell for a surety? But the name of that family is the name you bear, Balfour of Shaws, an ancient, reputable house. Your father, too, was a man of learning. No man more plausibly conducted school, nor had he the manner of a common dominie." He gave me the letter, which was addressed in these words: "To the hands of Ebenezer Balfour, Esquire, of Shaws. These will be delivered by my son, David Balfour." My heart was beating hard. "Mr. Campbell, and if you were in my shoes, would you go?" "Of a surety," said the minister. "That would I. You should get to Cramond, which is near in by Edinburgh, in 2 days of walk. If the worst came to the worst, and your high relations, as I cannot but suppose them to be, should put you to the door, you can but walk the 2 days back again, and risp at the manse door. And here, Davy," he resumed, "it lies near my conscience to set you on guard against the dangers of the world." With that, he took off his hat and prayed a little aloud, for a young man setting out into the world. Then suddenly embraced me very hard, then held me at arm's length, his face all working with sorrow, and then whipped about, and crying goodbye to me, set off the way we had come at a sort of jogging run. It might have been laughable to another, but I was in no mind to laugh. I watched him as long as he was in sight, and took my last look at Kirk Essendine, the trees about the manse, and the big rounds in the kirkyard where my father and mother lay. In the forenoon of the second day, coming to the top of a hill, I saw the country fall away before me down to the sea, and in the midst of this descent, on a long ridge, the city of Edinburgh, smoking like a kiln. There was a flag upon the castle, and ships moving or lying anchored in the firth, and both brought my country heart into my mouth. Presently after, I came by a house where a shepherd lived, and got a rough direction for the neighbourhood of Cramond, and so from one direction to another worked my way westward of the capital till I was told I was in Cramond parish, and began to substitute in my inquiries the name of the house of Shaws. It was a word that seemed to surprise those of whom I sought my way. After 2 or maybe 3 had given me the same look and answer, I began to take it in my head there was something strange about the Shaws. It was drawing on to sundown when I met a stout, sour-looking woman coming trudging down a hill, and she, when I had put my usual question, turned sharp about, back to the summit she had just left, and pointed to a great bulk of a building standing very bare upon a green in the bottom of the next valley. The woman's face lit up with a malignant anger. "That is the house of Shaws," she cried. "Blood built it, blood stopped the building of it, blood shall bring it down. See here, I spit upon the ground, and crack my thumb at it. Black be its fall. If you see the laird, tell him this makes the 1219th time that Janet Clouston has called down the curse on him and his house, byre and stable." And the woman turned with a skip and was gone. I sat me down and stared at the house of Shaws. The more I looked, the pleasanter that countryside appeared, being all set with hawthorn bushes full of flowers, the fields dotted with sheep, and every sign of a kind soil and climate. And yet the barrack in the midst of it went sore against my fancy. The nearer I got, the drearier it appeared. It seemed like the one wing of the house had never been finished. What should have been the inner end stood open on the upper floors, and showed against the sky with steps and stairs of uncompleted masonry. The night had begun to fall as I got close, and in 3 of the windows, very high up and well barred, a little fire began to glimmer. I came forward cautiously, and giving ear, heard a little dry, eager cough that came in fits. The door was a great piece of wood all studded with nails. I knocked once, then I stood and waited. A whole minute passed away, and nothing stirred. Whoever was in that house kept deadly still, and must have held his breath. I was in 2 minds whether to run away, but anger got the upper hand, and I began to rain kicks and buffets on the door. I was in full career when I heard the cough right overhead, and looking up beheld a man in a nightcap, and the bell-mouth of a blunderbuss at one of the first-story windows. "It's loaded," said a voice. "I have come here with a letter," I said, "to Mr. Ebenezer Balfour of Shaw's. It is a letter of introduction." "Ah, what?" I repeated what I had said. "Who are you, yourself?" was the next question, after a considerable pause. "I am not ashamed of my name. They call me David Balfour." It was with a curious change of voice that the next question followed. "Is your father dead?" I was so much surprised at this that I could find no voice to answer. "Aye," the man resumed. "He'll be dead, no doubt. And that'll be what brings ye chapping to my door. Well, man, I'll let ye in." Presently there was a great rattling of chains and bolts, and the door was cautiously opened. "Go into the kitchen and touch Nathan," said the voice, and the person of the house set himself to replacing the defences of the door. I groped my way forward and entered the kitchen. The fire had burned up fairly bright, and showed me the barest room I ever put my eyes on. 6 dishes stood upon the shelves. The table was laid for supper with a bowl of porridge, a horn-spoon, and a cup of small beer. There was not another thing in that great stone-vaulted chamber but lock-fast chests against the wall and a corner cupboard with a padlock. The man rejoined me. He was a mean, stooping, clay-faced creature, his age anything between 50 and 70. He seemed like an old, unprofitable serving man. "Are ye sharp set?" he asked. "You can eat that drop porridge?" I said I feared it was his own supper. "Oh, I can do fine wanting it. Let's see the letter." I told him the letter was for Mr. Balfour, not for him. "And who do you think I am? Give me Alexander's letter," he returned. "Little as you seem to like either me or my house, I'm your born uncle, Davy, my man." My uncle turned the letter over and over in his hands. "Do you ken what's in it?" he asked suddenly. "You see for yourself, sir, that the seal has not been broken." "I was a secret man, Alexander, a secret, silent man. He never said muckle when he was young. He'll never have spoken muckle of me." "I never knew, sir, that he had any brother." "Nor yet of Shaw's, I dare say." "Not so much as the name, sir." To think of that. A strange nature of a man." He seemed singularly satisfied, for presently he jumped up. "I will agree fine yet," he cried. "I'm just as glad as I let you in. Now come and watch your bed." To my surprise, he lit no lamp or candle, but set forth into the dark passage, groping his way up a flight of steps, and paused before a door. He bade me go in. I did as he bid, but begged a light to go to bed with. "Hoot toot," said he. "Lights in a house is a thing I dinna agree with. A man co feared of fires. Good night, ye." He pulled the door, and I heard him lock me in. The room was as cold as a well, and the bed as damp as a peat hag. By good fortune I had caught up my bundle and my plaid, and rolling myself in the latter, I fell speedily asleep. With the first peep of day, I opened my eyes, to find myself in a great chamber, hung with stamped leather and furnished with fine embroidered furniture. 10 years ago, or perhaps 20, it must have been as pleasant a room as a man could wish, but damp, dirt, disuse, and mice had done their worst since then. I knocked and shouted till my jailer came and let me out. He carried me to the back of the house, where was a draw-well, and told me to wash there if I wanted. And when that was done, I made my way back to the kitchen, where he was making the porridge. When we had made an end of our meal, my Uncle Ebenezer sat at one of the windows and silently smoked. From time to time his eyes came coasting round to me, and he shot out one of his questions. Once it was, "And your mother?" And when I told him that she too was dead, "Aye, she was a bonny lassie." Then after another long pause, "Davy, my man, you've come to the right bit when you came to your uncle. I've a great notion of the family, and I mean to do the right bit by you. What's mine is yours, Davy, and what's yours is mine. Blood's thicker than water, and there's naebody but you and me that ought the name." And then on he rambled about the family and its ancient greatness, and his father that began to enlarge the house, and himself that stopped the building as a sinful waste. "Uncle Ebenezer," I said, "I can make nothing out of this. You hate to have me in this house. You let me see it every word and every minute. Let me gang back to the friends I have."
Na, he said very earnestly. "I like you fine. We'll agree fine yet. Just you bide here quiet a bitty, and you'll find that we agree."
"Well, sir," said I, after I had thought the matter out in silence, "I'll stay a while. It's more just I should be helped by my own blood than strangers, and if we don't agree, it shall be through no fault of mine." For a day that was begun so ill, the day passed fairly well. We had the porridge cold again at noon, and hot porridge at night. Porridge and small beer was my uncle's diet. In a room next door to the kitchen I found a great number of books, both Latin and English, in which I took great pleasure. Indeed, the time passed so lightly in this good company that I began to be almost reconciled to my residence at Shaw's. One thing I discovered which put me in some doubt. This was an entry on the fly-leaf of a chapbook, one of Patrick Walker's, plainly written in my father's hand, "To my brother Ebenezer on his 5th birthday." What puzzled me was this. As my father was, of course, the younger brother, he must have written, before he was yet 5, an excellent, clear, manly hand of writing. At length I went back into the kitchen and sat down once more to porridge and small beer. Uncle Ebenezer, when he had cleared the platter, just as in the morning, sat a while smoking, with his back to me.
"Davy,"
he said at length,
"I've been thinking. There's a wee bit siller that I half promised you before you were born. Promised it to your father. It isn't legal, you understand. A matter of just exactly £40.
This he rapped out over his shoulder, and the next moment added, almost with a scream,
"Scots!"
Now, the pound Scots being the same thing as an English shilling, I made no attempt to conceal the tone of raillery in which I answered. "Oh, think again, sir. Pounds sterling, I believe."
That's what I said. Pound sterling. And if you'll step out by to the door a minute, just to see what kind of night it is, I'll get it out to you.
When I was called in again, my uncle counted out into my hand 37 golden guinea pieces. The rest was in his hand, in small gold and silver, but his heart failed him, and he crammed the change into his pocket.
"No word," said he. "Nae thanks, I want nae thanks. I do my duty, but see here, tit for tat."
I told him I was ready to prove my gratitude in any reasonable degree, and then waited, looking for some monstrous demand. And yet, when at last he plucked up courage to speak, it was only to tell me that he was growing old and a little broken and would expect me to help him. I expressed my readiness to serve. He pulled out of his pocket a rusty key.
"There," says he. "There's the key to the stair tower. You can only win into it from the outside, for that part of the house is no finished. Gang ye in there and bring me down the chest that's at the top."
"Can I have a light, sir?" said I.
"Nah, nae lights in my house."
"Very well, sir," said I. "Are the stairs good?"
"They're grand. Keep to the wall," he added. "There's nae banisters."
When I stepped into the tower, it was dark inside. It seemed a body could scarce breathe. I pushed out with foot and hand, and presently struck the wall with the one and the lowermost round of the stair with the other. The steps, though steep and narrow, were regular and solid underfoot. The house of Shaw's stood some 5 full stories high. Well, as I advanced, it seemed to me the stair grew airier and more lightsome, and I was wondering what might be the cause when a sudden blink of summer lightning came and went. If I did not cry out, it was because fear had me by the throat, and if I did not fall, it was by heaven's mercy. The flash shone in on every side through breaches in the wall, so that I seemed to be clambering aloft upon an open scaffold, and one of my feet rested that moment within 2 inches of the well. Feeling forward, my hand slipped upon an edge and found nothing but emptiness beyond it. The stair had been carried no higher. To set a stranger mounting it in darkness was to send him straight to his death. I groped my way down with wonderful anger in my heart. The wind sprung up in a clap, the rain followed, and before I had reached the ground it fell in buckets. The door stood open and shed a little glimmer of light. I could see a figure standing in the rain, and then a blinding flash showed me my uncle plainly. He ran into the house. I followed as softly as I could, and coming unheard into the kitchen, stood and watched him. He had found time to bring out a great case bottle of aqua vitae, and now sat with his back towards me. Ever and again he would groan aloud and drink down the raw spirits by the mouthful. I stepped forward, came close behind him where he sat, and suddenly, clapping my 2 hands down upon his shoulders, "Ah!" cried I. My uncle gave a kind of broken cry like a sheep's bleat, flung up his arms, and tumbled to the floor like a dead man. He lay as he had fallen, all huddled, with one knee up and one arm sprawling abroad. His face had a strange colour of blue, and he seemed to have ceased breathing. Fear came on me that he was dead. And then I got water and dashed it in his face, and with that he seemed to come a little to himself, working his mouth and fluttering his eyelids. At last he looked up and saw me, and there came into his eyes a terror that was not of this world. "Come, come," said I, "sit up."
"Are you alive?"
he sobbed. "Oh, man, are you alive?" "That I am, small thanks to you." I set him in a chair. It's true I felt some pity for a man that looked so sick, but I was full besides of a righteous anger, and I numbered over before him the points on which I wanted explanation. Why he lied to me at every word, why he feared that I should leave him, and why he had given me money, and why he had tried to kill me. He heard me through in silence, and then, in a broken voice, begged me to let him go to bed.
I'll tell you the morn," he said. "As sure as death, I will."
And so weak was he that I could do nothing but consent. I locked him into his room, however, and pocketed the key. The next morning there blew a bitter wintry wind out of the northwest. For all that, I made my way to the burn and had a plunge in a whirling pool. All aglow, I sat down beside the fire to consider my position. There was no doubt about my uncle's enmity, but I was young and spirited and had a great opinion of my shrewdness. In my conceit, I was sure I was his match. Presently, I gave my prisoner his liberty, and soon we were set to breakfast. "Well, sir," said I, "have you nothing more to say to me? What cause you have to fear me, to cheat me, and to attempt my life?" He murmured something about a jest, and then, seeing me smile, changed his tone, and assured me he would make all clear. I saw by his face he had no lie ready, though he was hard at work preparing one, and I was about to tell him so when we were interrupted by a knock at the door. I went to open it and found on the doorstep a half-grown boy in sea-clothes. He was blue with cold, and there was something in his face, a look between tears and laughter, that was highly pathetic. "What's here, mate?" said he, with a cracked voice. I asked him soberly to name his business. "Oh, pleasure," said he, and then began to sing. "For it's my delight of a shiny night in the season of the year." "Well," said I, "if you have no business, I will even be so unmannerly as to shut you out." "Stay, brother," he cried. "Have you no fun about you, or do you want to get me thrashed? I brought a letter to Mr. Bellflower." He showed me a letter. "And I say, mate, I'm mortal hungry." I brought him in, and he fell to greedily in the remains of breakfast. Meanwhile, my uncle read the letter and sat thinking. Then suddenly he got to his feet. "Read that," said he, and put the letter in my hand. "From the Hawes Inn at the Queen's Ferry. Sir, I lie here with my hawser up and down, and send my cabin boy to inform. If you have any further commands for overseas, today will be the last occasion, as the wind will serve us well out of the Firth. I have drawn a bill upon you as per margin, and am, sir, your most obedient, humble servant, Elias Hoseason."
"You see, Davy,"
resumed my uncle, as soon as he saw what I had done,
"I have a venture with this man, Hoseason. He's captain of a trading brig, the Covenant. If you and me was to walk over with yon lad, I could see the captain at the Hawes, and so far from a loss of time, we can jog on to the lawyer, Mr. Rankeeler's. You'll believe, Rankeeler, he's factor to half the gentry in these parts, highly respect it, and he kens your father."
I stood a while and thought. I was going to some place which was doubtless populous, and where my uncle durst attempt no violence, and perhaps, in the bottom of my heart, I wished a nearer view of the sea and ships. "Very well," said I, "let us go to the ferry." Uncle Ebenezer trudged in the ditch. He never said a word, and I was thrown for talk on the cabin boy. He told me his name was Ransom, and that he had followed the sea since he was 9, but he could not say how old he was, as he had lost his reckoning. I asked him of the brig, which he declared was the finest ship that sailed, and of Captain Hoseason, in whose praise he was equally loud. He would only admit one flaw in his idol. "He ain't no seaman," he admitted. "That's Mr. Sean that navigates the brig. He's the finest seaman in the trade. Only for drink. Why, look here," and turned down his stocking. He showed me a great raw red wound that made my blood run cold.
"He done that. Mr. Shaw done it," he said with an air of pride.
Just then we came to the top of a hill and looked down on the ferry in the Hope. The Firth of Forth narrows at this point, which makes a convenient ferry going north. On the south shore they've built a pier for the service of the ferry, and at the end of the pier, on the other side of the road, I could see the building which they call the Hawes Inn. A skiff lay beside the pier. This, Ransom told me, was the brig's boat, and about half a mile off he showed me the Covenant herself. There was a sea-going bustle on board, yards were swinging into place, and I could hear the song of the sailors as they pulled upon the ropes. As soon as we came to the inn, Ransom led us up the stairs to a small room, with a bed in it, and heated like an oven by a great fire of coal. At a table hard by the chimney, a tall, dark, sober-looking man sat writing. He got to his feet and offered his large hand to Ebenezer. "Mr. Balfour, I'm glad that you're here in time. The wind's fair and the tide's upon the turn." Though I had promised myself not to let my kinsman out of sight, I was so sickened by the closeness of the room that when he told me to run downstairs and play myself a while, I was fool enough to take him at his word. Even so far up the Firth, the smell of the sea water was exceeding salt and stirring. The Covenant, besides, was beginning to shake out her sails, and all that I beheld put me in thought of foreign places. Ransom came out of the inn crying for a bowl of punch. I told him I would give him no such thing. "But a glass of ale you may have, and welcome." And presently we were set down in the inn. As the landlord was a man of the country, I called him back to ask if he knew Mr. Rankeeler.
"Hoot, aye," says he, "and a very honest man. And, oh, by the way, was it you came with Ebenezer?"
I told him yes.
"You'll be no friend of his?"
I told him no, none. I said it seemed Ebenezer was ill seen in the country.
"Nae doot," said the landlord. "He's a wicked old man. And yet he was ance a fine young felly too, but that was before the soch gaed abroad about Mr. Alexander."
"And what was it?" I asked.
"Oh, just that he'd killed him."
"And what would he kill him for?"
"And what for but just to get the place?"
"The Shaws? Is that so? Was Alexander the eldest son?"
"Indeed he was," said the landlord. "What else would he have killed him for?"
And with that he went away. Of course I'd guessed it a long while ago, but it is one thing to guess and another to know, and I sat stunned with my good fortune. The next thing I heard my uncle calling me, and found the pair in the road together. It was the captain who addressed me, and that with an air very flattering to a young lad of grave equality. "Sir, Mr. Balfour tells me great things of you. I wish I was longer here that we might make the better friends, but you shall come on board my brig for half an hour till the ebb sets and drink a bowl with me." Now I longed to see the inside of a ship more than words can tell, but I told him my uncle and I had an appointment with a lawyer. Aye, said he. "But the boat'll set you ashore at the town pier, and that's a penny stonecast from Rankeeler's house." And here he suddenly leaned forward and whispered, "Take care of the old Tod. He means mischief. Come aboard till I can get a word with you." By this time we were at the boat's side, and he was handing me in. I did not dream of hanging back. I thought that I had found a good friend, and I was rejoiced to see the ship. The boat began to move over the waters, and what with my pleasure in the movement and the growing bigness of the brig, I could hardly understand what the captain said, and answered him at random. As soon as I was set down on the deck, the captain slipped his arm under mine. There I stood some while, a little dizzy with the unsteadiness of all around me, and yet vastly pleased with these strange sights. The captain pointed out the strangest, and telling me their names and uses. "But where is my uncle?" said I, suddenly. "Aye," said Hoseason, "that's the point." Sure enough, there was the boat pulling for the town, with my uncle sitting in the stern. And now a thunderstroke seemed to strike me. I saw a great flash of fire, and fell senseless. I came to myself in darkness, in great pain, bound hand and foot, and deafened by many unfamiliar noises. There sounded in my ears a roaring of water, the thundering of the sails, and the shrill cries of seamen. It took me a long while to realize I must be lying somewhere in the belly of the ship. I had no measure of time. Day and night were alike in that cavern of the ship's bowels. But sleep at length stole from me the consciousness of sorrow. I was wakened by the light of a hand lantern shining in my face. A small man of about 30, with green eyes, stood looking down on me. "Well, how goes it?" I answered with a sob, and my visitor set himself to wash and dress the wound on my scalp, gave me some brandy and water in a tin pannikin, and left me once more to myself. The next time he came to see me, I was lying betwixt sleep and waking, my eyes wide open in the darkness. The man with green eyes was the first to descend the ladder, and he came somewhat unsteadily. He was followed by the captain. Neither said a word, but the first set to and examined me, and dressed my wound as before.
"Now, sir, you see for yourself,"
said the first. "I'm no conjurer, Mr. Reich," said the captain.
"I want that boy taken out of this hole and put in the forecastle."
"What you may want, sir, is a matter of concern to nobody but yourself," returned the captain. "But I can tell you, here he is, here he shall bide."
"Admitting that you've been paid in a proportion," said the other, "I will crave leave to say that I have not. Paid I am to be the second officer of this old tub, but for nothing more. Admitting that you have been paid to do a murder—"
Hoseason turned upon him with a flash.
"What's that? Mr. Reich, I have sailed with you 3 cruises, and in all that time, sir, you should have learned to know me. I'm a stiff man and a dour man, but for what you say now, fie, if you say the lad will die—"
"Aye, will he?" said Mr. Reich.
"Well, sir, is that not enough? Flit him where you please."
5 minutes afterwards my bonds were cut. I was hoisted on a man's back up to the forecastle and laid in a bunk on some sea blankets. It was a blessed thing to open my eyes again upon daylight and find myself in the society of men. The forecastle was set about with berths in which the men of the watch below were seated smoking or lying down asleep. The scuttle was open, and a dusty beam of sunlight shone in and dazzled and delighted me. Here I lay for many days, a close prisoner, and not only got my health again, but came to know my companions. They were a rough lot indeed, as sailors mostly are, being men rooted out of all the kindly parts of life and condemned to toss together on the rough seas, with masters no less cruel. But they had many virtues. They were kind when it occurred to them, simple even beyond the simplicity of a country lad like me, and had some glimmerings of honesty. Amongst other good deeds that they did, they returned my money, which had been shared among them, and though it was about a third short, I was very glad to get it, and hoped great good from it in the land I was going to. The ship was bound for the Carolinas, and you must not suppose that I was going to that place merely as an exile. In these days of my youth, white men were still sold into slavery on the plantations, and that was the destiny to which my uncle had condemned me. The cabin boy Ransom, from whom I had first heard of these atrocities, came in at times from the roundhouse, where he berthed and served, now nursing a bruised limb in silent agony, now raving against the cruelty of Mr. Shawn. Indeed, I found there was a strange peculiarity about our 2 mates, that Mr. Reich was sullen, unkind, and harsh when he was sober, and Mr. Shawn would not hurt a fly except when he was drinking. I asked about the captain, but I was told drink made no difference upon this man of iron. One night, about 9 o'clock, a man of Mr. Reich's watch, which was on deck, came down for his jacket, and instantly there began to go a whisper about the forecastle that Shawn had done for him at last. We had scarce time to speak when the scuttle was flung open, and Captain Hoseason came down the ladder. Walking straight up to me, he addressed me, to my surprise, in tones of kindness. "My man, we want you to serve in the roundhouse. You and Ransom are to change berths. Run away after you." Even as he spoke, 2 seamen appeared, carrying Ransom in their arms. The boy's face was as white as wax, and had a look upon it like a dreadful smile. The blood in me ran cold, and I drew in my breath as if I had been struck. "Run away aft! Run away after you!" cried Hoseason, and at that I brushed by the sailors and the boy, who neither spoke nor moved, and ran up the ladder on deck. The roundhouse for which I was bound, and where I was now to sleep and serve, stood some 6 feet above the decks. Inside were a fixed table and bench, and 2 berths, one for the captain and one for the 2 mates, turn and turn about. It was all fitted with lockers from top to bottom, so as to stow away the officers' belongings and a part of the ship's stores. Indeed, all the best of the meat and the drink, and the whole of the powder were collected in this place, and all the firearms. A small window, with a shutter on each side and a skylight in the roof, gave it light by day, and after dark there was a lamp always burning. It was burning when I entered, brightly enough to show Mr. Shawn sitting at the table with the brandy bottle in front of him. He took no notice of my coming in, nor did he move when the captain followed and leant on the berth beside me, looking darkly at the mate. Presently Mr. Reich came in. He gave the captain a glance that meant the boy was dead, as plain as speaking, and took his place like the rest of us. All of a sudden, Mr. Shawn put out his hand to take the bottle, and at that Mr. Riach caught it away from him. Crying out with an oath, and the weather sliding door standing open, he tossed the bottle into the sea. Mr. Shawn was on his feet in a trice. He meant murder, and would have done it for the second time that night had not the captain stepped in.
"Sit down, you sot and swine. Do you know what you've done? You've murdered the boy."
Mr. Shawn seemed to understand, for he sat down again and put his hand to his brow. "Well," he said,
"he bought me a dirty pannikin."
More than a week went by in which ill luck pursued the Covenant. Some days she made a little way, others she was driven actually back. We tossed and tacked the whole of the 9th day, within sight of Cape Wrath and the wild rocky coast on either hand of it. The 10th afternoon there was a thick, wet, white fog. Maybe about 10 at night, I was serving Mr. Riach and the captain at supper, when the ship struck something with a great sound, and we heard voices singing out.
"She's struck,"
said Mr. Riach.
"No, sir," said the captain. "We've only run a boat down." And they hurried out.
The captain was in the right of it. We had run down a boat in the fog, and she'd gone to the bottom with all her crew but one. This man had been sitting in the stern as a passenger. The stern had been thrown in the air, and the man had leaped up and caught hold of the brig's bowsprit. It showed that he had luck and much agility that he had thus saved himself. And yet, when the captain brought him into the roundhouse, he looked as cool as I did. He was smallish in stature, but well set. His face was sunburnt, very dark, and pitted with the smallpox. His eyes were unusually light, and he had a kind of dancing madness in them. When he took off his greatcoat, he laid a pair of fine silver-mounted pistols on the table, and I saw that he was belted with a great sword. As soon as he had taken off his greatcoat, he showed forth a blue coat with silver buttons and handsome silver lace.
"I'm vexed, sir, about the boat," said the captain.
"There are some pretty men gone to the bottom," said the stranger, "that I would rather see on dry land again than half a score of boats."
"Friends of yours?"
said Hoseason. "You have none such friends in your country. They would have died for me like dogs."
"Well, sir,"
said the captain, watching him,
"I have been in France, sir."
So that it was plain he meant more by these words than showed on the face of them. "Oh-ho," said the stranger. "Is that how the wind sets?" And he laid his hand quickly on his pistols.
"Don't be hasty," said the captain. "You have a French soldier's coat upon your back and a Scotch tongue in your head, to be sure. But so has many an honest fellow in these days."
"So?" said the gentleman in the fine coat. "Are you of the honest party?" Meaning, was he a Jacobite? For each side in these civil broils takes the name of honesty for his own.
"Why, sir," replied the captain, "I am a true blue Protestant, and I thank God for it. But for all that, I can be sorry to see another man with his back to the wall."
"Can you so indeed?" asked the Jacobite. "Well, sir, to be quite plain with you, I am one of those honest gentlemen that were in trouble about the years 45 and 6, and if I got into the hands of any of the red-coated gentry, it would go hard with me. Now, sir, I was for France, and there was a French ship cruising here to pick me up, but she gave us the go-by in the fog, as I wish you had done yourself. If you can set me ashore where I was going, I will reward you highly for your trouble."
"In France?" said the captain. "No, sir. But where you came from, we might talk of that."
And then he packed me off to the galley to get supper for the gentleman. I'd lost no time, I promise you. And when I came back, I found the gentleman had taken a money belt from about his waist and poured out a guinea or two upon the table. The captain was looking at the guineas and then at the belt.
"Half of it," he cried, "and I'm your man."
The other swept back the guineas into the belt and put it on again under his waistcoat. "Sir, not one dite of it belongs to me. It belongs to my chieftain." And here he touched his hat. "And while I would be but a silly messenger to grudge some of it that the rest might come safe, I should show myself a hound indeed if I bought my own carcass too dear. 30 guineas on the seaside, or 60 if you set me on the Linney Loch. Take it if you will. If not, you can do your worst."
"Aye," said Hoseason, "and if I give you over to the soldiers?"
"You would make a fool's bargain. My chief is forfeited. His estate is in the hands of the man they call King George. But for the honour of Scotland, the poor tenant bodies take a thought to their chief in exile. This is part of the very rent for which King George is looking. Bring this money within the reach of government, and how much of it'll come to you?"
"Little enough, to be sure," said Hoseason, and then, "Well, what must be, must. 60 guineas and done. There's my hand upon it."
and thereupon the captain went out, rather hurriedly, I thought, and left me alone with the stranger. "So you're a Jacobite," said I, as I set meat before him. "Aye," said he, beginning to eat, "and you, by your long face, should be a Whig." "Betwixt and between," said I, not to annoy him, for indeed I was as good a Whig as Mr. Campbell could make me. "And that's naething," said he. "But I'm saying, Mr. Betwixt and Between, this bottle of yours is dry, and it's hard if I'm to pay 60 guineas and be grudged a dram upon the back of it." "I'll go and ask for the key," said I, and stepped on deck. The fog was close as ever. Some of the hands were hearkening for breakers, but the captain and the 2 officers were in the waist, with their heads together. It struck me they were up to no good. The first word I heard confirmed me. It was Mr. Reich crying out, "Couldn't we whale him out of the roundhouse?"
"He's better where he is," returned Hoseason. "He hasn't room to use his sword. We can get the man in talk, one upon each side, and pin him by the 2 arms before he has the time to draw."
At this hearing, I was seized with both fear and anger at these treacherous, greedy, bloody men that I sailed with. I began to go slowly back to the roundhouse. What was I to do? They were dogs and thieves. They had stolen me from my own country. They had killed poor Ransom. But then, what could a boy and a man if they were as brave as lions against the whole ship's company? I was still arguing it back and forth when I came into the roundhouse and saw the Jacobite eating his supper under the lamp. My mind was made up all in a moment. "Do you want to be killed?" said I. He sprang to his feet. "Oh," cried I, "they're all murderers here. They've murdered a boy already. Now it's you." Aye, but they haven't got me yet." And then looking at me curiously, "Will you stand with me?" "I'm no thief, nor yet murderer. I'll stand by you." "Why then," said he, "what's your name?" "David Balfour," said I, then added for the first time, "of Shaw's." "My name is Stuart," he said, drawing himself up. "Alan Breck, they call me. A king's name is good enough for me, although I have the name of no farm midden to clap the hind end of it." And having administered this rebuke, as though it were something of chief importance, he turned to examine our defences. The roundhouse was built very strong to support the breaching of the seas. Of its 5 apertures, only the skylight and the 2 doors were large enough to admit the passage of a man. The doors ran in grooves. One was already shut, but when I was proceeding to slide to the other, Alan stopped me. "David, that door being open is the best part of my defences. So long as that door is opened and my face to it, my enemies will be in front of me." And then he set me down to the table with a powder horn, a bag of bullets, and all the pistols, which he made me charge. "And that will be better work, let me tell you, for a gentleman of decent birth, than scraping plates and raxing drams to a queen of tarry sailors. How many are against us?" I reckoned them up. 15. Alan whistled. "Well, that can't be cured. Now it is my part to keep this door where I look for the main battle. In that you have no hand." I told him I was no great shot. "And that's very bravely said," he cried. "There's many a pretty gentleman that wouldn't dare to say it. Aye. No sooner the pistol's charged than you must climb into yon bed where you're handy at the window, and if they lift hand against the door, you're to shoot." But now our time of truce was come to an end, and scarce had Alan spoken when the captain showed his face in the open door. "Stand!" cried Alan, and pointed his sword at him. The captain neither winced nor drew back a foot.
"A naked sword! This is a strange return for hospitality."
"Do you see me?" said Alan. "I come of kings. I bear a king's name. Do you see my sword? It has slashed the heads off mere whigamores than you have toes upon your feet. Call up your vermin to your back, sir, and fall on. The sooner the clash begins, the sooner you'll taste the steel through your vitals." The captain looked over at me with an ugly look.
"David, I'll mind this."
Next moment he was gone. I clambered up into the berth with an armful of pistols and something of a heavy heart. A little after, and there came a clash of steel upon the deck, by which I knew they were dealing out the cutlasses, and one had been let fall. I do not know if I was what you call afraid, but my heart beat like a bird's. I tried to pray, I remember, and my chief wish was to have the thing begin and be done with. It came all of a sudden when it did, with a rush of feet and a roar, and then a shout from Alan and a sound of blows. I saw Mr. Shawn in the doorway, crossing blades with Alan. "That's him that killed the boy," I cried. "Look to your window," said Alan, and as I turned back I saw him pass his sword through the mate's body. My head was scarce back at the window before 5 men, carrying a spare yard for a battering ram, ran past me and took post to drive the door in. I had never fired with a pistol in my life, but it was now or never. I cried out, "Take that!" and shot into their midst. I must have hit one of them, for he sang out and the rest stopped. Before they had time to recover, I sent another ball over their heads, and at my third shot the whole party threw down the yard and ran for it. Then I looked round again. On the floor was Mr. Shawn on his hands and knees. The blood was pouring from his mouth. Some of those from behind caught hold of him by the heels and dragged him out. I believe he died as they were doing it. "There's one of your quigs for you," cried Alan, and asked if I'd done much execution. I told him I had winged one and thought it was the captain. "And I've settled too," said he. "Now there's not enough blood let. They'll be back again." I settled back in my place, recharging the pistols I'd fired. There was nothing to do but listen and wait. Presently I began to hear stealthy steps and a brushing of men's clothes against the roundhouse wall. Then there came a single call on the sea-pipe, and that was the signal. A knot of them made one rush of it, cutlass in hand, against the door, and at the same moment the glass of the skylight was dashed in 1,000 pieces, and a man leapt through and landed on the floor. I gave a shriek and shot him in the midst of the body. He gave the most horrible, ugly groan and fell to the floor. The foot of a second fellow, whose legs were dangling through the skylight, struck me upon the head, and at that I snatched another pistol and shot this one through the thigh, so that he tumbled in a lump on his companion's body. I heard Alan shout as if for help. One of the seamen had run under his guard and caught him about the body. Alan was dirking him with his left hand. The door was thronged, but Alan, leaping back to get his distance, ran upon the others, roaring as he went. They broke before him like water, turning and running and falling one against another in their haste. The sword in his hands flashed like quicksilver into the huddle of our fleeing enemies, and at every flash there came a scream of a man hurt. Yet he was no sooner out than he was back again, being as cautious as he was brave, and meanwhile the seamen continued running, and we heard them tumble into the forecastle and clap to the hatch. The roundhouse was like a shambles. 3 were dead inside, another lay across the threshold, and there were Alan and I, victorious and unhurt. "Come to my arms," he cried, and embraced and kissed me hard upon both cheeks. "David," said he, "I love you like a brother, and oh man," he cried in a kind of ecstasy, "am I no a bonny fighter?" Thereupon he turned to the 4 enemies, passed his sword clean through each one of them, and tumbled them out of the door, one after the other. In the meanwhile, the thought of the 2 men I had shot sat upon me like a nightmare, and upon a sudden I began to sob and cry like any child. Alan clapped my shoulder and said I was a brave lad and wanted nothing but sleep. "I'll take the first watch," said he. "You've done well by me, David, first and last, and I wouldn't lose you for all Appin. No, nor for Breadalbin." So he took the first spell, pistol in hand, 3 hours by the captain's watch upon the wall. Then he roused me up, and I took my turn. All my watch there was nothing stirring, and at last, looking out of the door of the roundhouse, I saw the great stone hills of Skye on the right hand, and, a little more astern, the strange isle of Rum. Alan and I sat down to breakfast about 6 of the clock. The floor was covered with broken glass and in a horrid mess of blood which took away my hunger. Alan, taking a knife from the table, cut me off one of the silver buttons from his coat. "I had them," said he, "from my father, Duncan Stewart, and now give you one to be a keepsake for last night's work. And wherever you show that button, the friends of Alan Breck will come around you." And then, taking off his coat, he began to visit his suit and brush away the stains with such care and labour as I suppose to have been only usual with women. When I saw what care he took to pluck out the threads where the button had been cut away, I put a higher value on his gift. He was still so engaged when we were hailed by Mr. Riach, asking for a parley. The parley was agreed to, and parole given upon either side. The captain came, as was agreed, to one of the windows, and stood there in the rain, with his arm in a sling, looking stern and pale. Alan at once held a pistol in his face. "Put that thing up," said the captain. "Have I not passed my word, sir?" "Captain," said Alan, "last night you passed me your word and gave me your hand to back it, and you ken very well what was the upshot. Be damned to your word." "Well, well, sir," said the captain, "you'll get little good by swearing." And truly that was a fault of which the captain was quite free. "But we have other things to speak. There is nothing left to me, sir, but to put into Glasgow." "No, that'll no do. You'll just have to set me ashore as we agreed." "Aye, but my first officer is dead. There's none of the rest of us acquaint with this coast." "I give you a choice. Set me on dry ground in Appin, or Ardgour, or in Morven, or Arisaig, or Morar, or where ye please within 30 miles of my own country, except in a country of the Campbells. That's a broad target. If you miss that, you must be as feckless at the sailoring as I found you at the fighting. 30 guineas if you land me on the seaside, and 60 if you put in Linney Loch and set me in my own country."
"Could you pilot us at all?"
asked the captain, who was frowning to himself. "Well, it's doubtful," said Alan. "But I have been often enough picked up and set down upon this coast, and should catch something of the lie of it." The captain shook his head, still frowning.
"Oh, be it as you will. As soon as I get a slant of wind, and there's some coming or I'm the more mistaken, I'll put it in hand."
Before we had done cleaning out the roundhouse, a breeze blew up from a little to the east of north and brought out the sun. All day the breeze held in the same point. By nightfall we had turned the end of Taree. Alan and I sat in the roundhouse with the doors open on each side and smoked a pipe or two of the captain's fine tobacco. We heard each other's stories, I telling him all my misfortune, which he heard with great good nature. Only when I came to mention that good friend of mine, Mr. Campbell the minister, Alan fired up and cried out he hated all that were of that name. "Why, Alan," I cried, "what ails ye at the Campbells?" "Well," says he, "ye ken very well that I am an Appin Stewart. The Campbells have long harried and wasted those of my name, aye, and got lands off us by treachery. But the heart of the matter is the business of my chief, Ardshiel." "I thought they called your chief Appin," said I. "Aye, but Ardshiel is the captain of the clan," said he, which scarcely cleared my mind. "You see, David, he that was all his life so great a man is now brought to live in a French town like a poor and private person. Now the tenants of Appin have to pay a rent to King George, but they are true to their chief, and what with love and a bit of pressure, and maybe a threat or two, the poor folk scrape up a second rent for Ardshiel. Well, David, I'm the hand that carries it." And he struck the belt about his body so that the guineas rang. "Do they pay both?" cried I. "2 rents?" "Aye, and it's wonderful how little pressure is needed, but that's the handiwork of my good kinsman, James of the Glens, Ardshiel's half-brother." "I call it noble," I cried. "I'm a Whig, but I call it noble." "Aye, you're a Whig, but you're a gentleman. Now, if you were the Red Fox—" And at that name his teeth shut together, and he ceased speaking. "And who is the Red Fox?" I asked, daunted, but still curious. "Well, and I'll tell you that. When the men of the clans were broken at Culloden, and the good cause went down, Ardshiel had to flee like a poor deer upon the mountains. But one thing they couldn't kill. That was the love the clansmen bore their chief. And now, in there steps a man, a Campbell, red-headed Colin of Glenure." "Him you call the Red Fox?" said I. "Aye, that's the man. So-called King's factor on the lands of Appin. He swore he would be rid of the loyal commons. Ardshiel was to starve, and them that fed him. He would drive them out. Therefore he sent for lawyers and papers and redcoats to stand at his back. And the kindly folk of that country must all pack and tramp, every father's son out of his father's house, and out of the place where he was bred and fed, and played when he was a callant. What cares Red Colin? If he can hurt Ardshiel, he has his wish. If he can pluck the meat from my chieftain's table, and the bit toys out of his children's hands, he will gang hame singing to Glenure." And with this Alan fell into a muse, and for a long time sate very sad and silent. It was already late at night, and as dark as it ever would be at that season of the year, and that is to say it was still pretty bright, when Hoseason clapped his head into the roundhouse door.
"Here," said he, "come out and see if you can pilot."
"Is this one of your tricks?" asked Alan.
"Do I look like tricks? I have other things to think of. My brig's in danger."
By the look of his face and the tones in which he spoke, it was plain he was in deadly earnest. And so Alan and I, with no great fear of treachery, stepped on deck. The sky was clear. It blew hard and was bitter cold. A great deal of daylight lingered, and the moon, which was nearly full, shone brightly. Away on the lee bow, a thing like a fountain rose out of the moonlit sea, and immediately after we heard a low sound of roaring.
"What do you call that?" asked the captain gloomily.
"The sea breaking on a reef," said Alan. "And now ye ken where it is, and what better would ye have?"
"Aye," said Hoseason, "if it was the only one."
And sure enough, just as he spoke, there came a second fountain further to the south.
"There," said Hoseason, "you see for yourself."
"I'm thinking," said Alan, "these'll be what they call the Torren Rocks."
"Are there many of them?" Truly, sir, I am nae pilot, but it sticks in my mind there are 10 miles of them.
Mr. Reich and the captain looked at each other.
There's a way through them, I suppose, said the captain.
Doubtless, said Alan.
But where?
But it somehow runs in my mind once more that it is clearer under the land.
So, said Hoseason, we'll have to haul our wind then, Mr. Reich. We'll have to come as near in about the end of Mull as we can take her, and even then we'll have the land to keep the wind off us, and the stone yard on our lee. Well, we're in for it now, and may as well crack on.
With that he gave an order to the steersman and sent Reich to the foretop. There were only 5 men on deck, counting the officers, that were fit for their work, so it fell to Mr. Reich to go aloft. Now and then, sheering to one side or the other to avoid a reef, but still hugging the land, we had got round Iona and began to come alongside Mull. The tide at the tail of the land was very strong, and this would have been our greatest danger had not the sea been for some while free of obstacles. Mr. Reich, besides, announced from the top that he saw clear water ahead.
You were right, said Hoseason to Alan. You have saved the brig, sir. I'll mind that when we come to clear accounts. Keep her away a point, sings out Mr. Reich. Reef to the windward.
And just at the same time, the tide caught the brig and threw the wind out of her sails. She came round like a top, and next moment struck the reef with such a dunch as threw us all flat upon the deck, and came near to shake Mr. Reich from his place upon the mast. I was on my feet in a minute. The reef in which we had struck was close in under the southwest of Mull, off a little isle they call Iraid, which lay low and black upon the larboard. The swell ground the poor brig upon the reef, and what with the great noise of the sails and the singing of the wind and the sense of danger, I think my head must have been partly turned. Presently I observed Mr. Reich and the seamen busy round the skiff, and such of the wounded as could move came clambering out and began to help, while the rest that lay helpless in their bunks harrowed me with screaming and begging to be saved. The captain took no part. It seemed he was struck stupid. His brig was like wife and child to him. He had looked on day by day at the mishandling of poor Ransom, but when it came to the brig, he seemed to suffer along with her. I asked Alan, looking across at the shore, what country it was, and he answered that it was the land of the Campbells. We had one of the wounded men told off to keep a watch upon the sea, and we had the boat about ready to be launched, when this man sang out, "For God's sake, hold on!" There followed a sea so huge that it lifted the brig right up and canted her over on her beam. Whether the cry came too late, or my hold was too weak, I do not know, but at the sudden tilting of the ship, I was clean cast over the bulwarks into the sea. I went down and drank my fill. They say a man sinks the 3rd time for good. I cannot be made like other folk then, for I would not like to say how often I went down or came up again. I was hurled along and choked, and then swallowed whole. Presently I found I was holding a spar, which helped me somewhat, and then all of a sudden I was in a quiet water and began to come to myself. It was the spare yard I'd got hold of, and I was amazed how far I had travelled from the brig. She was holding together, but whether they had yet launched the boat, I was too far off and too low down to see. I lay quite becalmed. The shores of Iraid were close in. I could see in the moonlight the dots of heather and the sparkling of mica in the rocks. I had no skill in swimming, Essen water being small in our neighbourhood, but I laid hold upon the yard with both arms, and in about an hour of kicking and splashing, it grew so shallow that I could leave the yard and wade ashore. I was tired as I never was before that night, and grateful to God, as I trust I have been often, though never with more cause. There was no sound of man or cattle, not a cock crew, though it was about the hour of their first waking. As soon as day began to break, I climbed a hill, the ruggedest scramble I ever undertook. When I got to the top, there was no sign of the brig, which must have sunk. The boat, too, was nowhere to be seen. There was never a sail upon the ocean, and in what I could see of the land was neither house nor man. I set off eastward along the south coast. After a little, my way was stopped by a creek or inlet of the sea, and as I had no means to get across, I must needs change direction to go about the end of it. It was the roughest kind of walking. Indeed, the whole of Iraid is nothing but a jumble of granite rocks with heather in among. At first the creek kept narrowing, but presently it began to widen out again, until it burst upon me that I was cast upon a little barren isle, and cut off on every side by the salt seas. It came on to rain with a thick mist. I stood in the rain and shivered till it occurred to me that perhaps the creek was fordable. Back I went to the narrowest point and waded in. but not 3 yards from the shore I plumped in head over ears. The time I spent upon the island is still so horrible a thought to me that I must pass it lightly over. In all the books I had read of people cast away, they had either their pockets full of tools or a chest of things would be thrown upon the beach. I had nothing in my pockets but money and Allen's silver button, and being inland bred, I was as much short of knowledge as of means. I knew indeed that shellfish were counted good to eat, and among the rocks found a great plenty of limpets. Of these I made my whole diet, devouring them cold and raw, and so hungry was I that at first they seemed delicious. But I had no sooner eaten my first meal than I was seized with giddiness and retching, and lay for a long time no better than dead. A second trial did better with me, but as long as I was on the island, I never knew what to expect when I had eaten. Charles II declared a man could stay outdoors more days in the climate of England than in any other. He must have had better luck in his flight from Worcester than I had on that miserable isle. It was the height of summer. It had rained for more than 24 hours and did not clear until the afternoon of the third day. This was the day of incidents. In the morning, as I was jumping about after my limpets, I was startled by a guinea piece which fell about a rock in front of me and glanced off into the sea. I carried my gold loose in a pocket with a button. I now saw that there must be a hole and clapped my hand to the place in a great hurry. But this was to lock the stable door after the steed was stolen. I had left the shore at Queensferry with near on £50. Now I found no more than 3 guinea pieces and a silver shilling, a fortune of £3 and 4 shillings English money for a lad the rightful heir of an estate, and now starving on an isle at the extreme end of the wild highlands. And yet the worst was not yet come. There is a pretty high rock on the northwest of Araid. As soon as the sun came out, I lay down on the top of that rock to dry myself. All of a sudden, a cobble with a brown sail and a pair of fishers aboard of it came flying round the corner of the isle, bound for Iona. I shouted out. They were near enough to hear, and there was no doubt but they observed me, for they cried out in the Gallic tongue and laughed. But the boat never turned aside, and flew on, right before my eyes, for Iona. I could not believe such wickedness, and ran along the shore, crying on them piteously. Even after they were out of reach of my voice, I still cried and waved to them, and when they were quite gone, I thought my heart would have burst. If a wish would kill men, those 2 fishers would never have seen morning, and I should likely have died upon my island. The next day, which was the 4th, I found my bodily strength very low, but what I managed to eat of the shellfish agreed well with me, and revived my courage. I was scarce back on my rock before I observed a boat coming down the sound, and with her head, I thought, in my direction, coming straight to Araid. I was able to perceive it was the same boat and the same 2 men as yesterday, but now there was a third man along with them. As soon as they were come within easy reach, they let down their sail and lay quiet. The new man stood up in the boat and addressed me a long while, with many wavings of his hand. I told him I had no Gaelic, and at this he became very angry, and I began to suspect he thought he was talking English. Listening very close, I caught the word whatever several times, and picked out another word, tide. I had a flash of hope. I remembered he was always waving his hand towards the mainland of Ross. "Do you mean when the tide is out?" I cried, and could not finish. "Yes, yes," said he, "tide." At that I turned tail upon their boat, and set off running across the isle. I came out upon the shores of the creek. It had shrunk to a little trickle of water through which I dashed not above my knees, and landed with a shout on the main island. A sea-bred boy would not have stayed a day on Araid, which is only what they call a tidal islet. But for the fishers, I might have left my bones there in pure folly. And even as it was, I had paid for it pretty dear, being clothed like a beggar man, scarce able to walk, and in great pain of a sore throat. The Ross of Mull, which I had now got upon, was rugged and trackless, like the isle I had just left, being all bog and briar and big stone. I aimed for the smoke I had seen from the island, and came upon the house at 5 or 6 at night. It was low and longish, roofed with turf, and built of unmortared stones, and on a mount in front of it, an old gentleman sat smoking his pipe in the sun. With what little English he had, he gave me to understand that my shipmates had got safe ashore, and had broken bread in that very house on the day after. Was there one, I asked, dressed like a gentleman? To be sure, the first of them, the one that came alone, wore breeches and stockings, while the rest had sailors' trousers. Then the old gentleman clapped his brow and cried out that I must be the lad with the silver button. "Why, yes," said I, in some wonder. "Well then, I have a word for you that you are to follow your friend to his country by Torosay." He then took me by the hand, led me into his hut, it was no better, and presented me before his wife, as if she had been a queen and I a duke. The good woman set oat bread before me and a cold grouse, and the old gentleman brewed me a strong punch. The punch threw me in a sweat and a deep slumber. It was near noon next day before I took the road. The old gentleman, though I pressed him hard, would take no money. I met plenty of people, grubbing in little miserable fields. They seemed in great poverty, which was no doubt natural, now the chiefs kept no longer an open house, and the roads were infested with beggars. I knew Torosay to be my destination, and repeated the name to them, but in reply they would give me a great screed of the Gaelic that set me foolish, so I went out of my road as often as I stayed in it. I travelled from Mairead to Torosay, 50 miles as the crow flies, and with my wanderings, much nearer 100 in 4 days. There is a ferry from Torosay to Kinlochaline on the mainland. Both shores are in the country of the MacLeans, and the people that passed the ferry with me were almost all of that clan. The skipper of the boat, on the other hand, was called Neil Roy MacRob, and since MacRob was one of the names of Alan's clansmen, and Alan himself had sent me to that ferry, I was eager to come to private speech of Neil Roy. In the crowded boat this was impossible, and the passage was a very slow affair. There was no wind, and we could pull but 2 oars on one side and one on the other. The men gave way, however, with a good will, the passengers taking spells to help them, and the whole company giving the time in Gaelic boat songs. And what with the songs, the sea air, and the bright weather, the passage was a pretty thing to have seen. At Kinlochaline I got Neil Roy upon one side on the beach, and said I made sure he was one of Appin's men. "And what for no?" said he. "I am seeking somebody, and it comes in my mind that you will have news of him. Alan Breck Stewart is his name, and very foolishly I sought to pass a shilling in his hand." At this he drew back. "I am affronted, and this is not the way that one gentleman should behave to another at all. The man you ask for is in France. But if he was in my sporran and your belly full of shillings, I would not hurt a hair upon his body." I saw I had gone the wrong way to work, and showed him the button lying in the hollow of my palm. I will," said Neil. "You might have begun with that end of the stick, whatever. But if you are the lad with the silver button, I have the word to see that you come safe. But if you will pardon me to speak plainly, there is a name you should never take into your mouth, and that is the name of Alan Breck. And there is a thing that ye should never do, and that is to offer your dirty money to a Hieland gentleman." Neil had no wish to prolong his dealings with me, and he made haste to give me my route. This was to lie the night at Kinlochaline in the public inn, to cross Morven to Ardgour, and lie the night in the house of one John of the Claymore. The third day to be set across one loch at Corran, and another at Ballachulish, and then ask my way to the house of James of the Glens at Ocharn in Duror of Appin. I had some other advice from Neil, to speak with no one by the way, to avoid Whigs, Campbells, and the Red Soldiers, and in brief to conduct myself like a robber or a Jacobite agent, as perhaps Neil thought me. The inn at Kinlochaline was the most beggarly, vile place that ever pigs were stayed in, and full of smoke, vermin, and silent Highlanders. Early in my next day's journey, I overtook a little, stout, solemn man, walking very slowly, with his toes turned out, sometimes reading in a book, and sometimes marking the place with his finger, and dressed decently and plainly in something of the clerical style. This I found to be a catechist sent out by the Edinburgh Society for Propagating Christian Knowledge, to evangelize the more savage places of the Highlands. His name was Henderland, and besides common countryship, we found we had a more particular bond of interest. For my good friend, the minister of Essendine, had translated into the Gaelic in his by-time a number of hymns and pious books, which Henderland used in his work, and held in great esteem. Indeed, it was one of these he was carrying and reading when we met. He told me much of his work and the people he worked among, the hiding priests and Jacobites, the disarming act, the dress, and many other curiosities of the time and place. He seemed moderate, blaming Parliament in several points, and especially because they had framed the act more severely against those who wore the dress than against those who carried weapons. This moderation put it in my mind to question him of the red fox and the Appin tenants, which I thought would seem natural enough in the mouth of one travelling to that country. He said it was a bad business.
"It's wonderful," said he, "where the tenants find the money, for their life is mere starvation. You don't carry such a thing as snuff, do you, Mr. Balfour?" "No." "Well, I'm better wanting it. But these tenants are doubtless partly driven to it. James Stewart in Duror, him they call James of the Glens, is half-brother to Art Shiel, and he is a man much looked up to and drives very hard. And then there's the one they call Alan Drake."
"Ah," cried I, "what of him?"
"What of the wind that bloweth where it listeth? He's a fair heather cat. He might be glowering at the two of us from yon windbush, and I wouldn't wonder. You'll no carry such a thing as snuff, would ye?"
I told him no. "And what is the King's agent about?" I asked.
"Golly Campbell, putting his head in a bee's bike."
"He's to turn the tenants out by force, I hear," said I.
"Yes, the first of the tenants are to flit tomorrow.
It's to begin at Duror under James' very windows, which doesn't seem wise by my humble way of it." "Do you think they'll fight?" I asked.
"Well, they're disarmed, they're supposed to be, and then Colin Campbell has the soldiers coming, but for all that, if I was his lady wife, I wouldn't be well pleased till I got him home again. They're queer customers, the Appin Stewarts."
So we continued talking and walking the great part of the day, until at last Mr. Henderland, expressing his delight in my company and satisfaction at meeting with a friend of Mr. Campbell's, "whom," says he,
"I will make bold to call the sweet singer of our covenanted Zion,"
proposed that I should make a short stage and lie the night at his house beyond King Gairloch. We had no sooner come to the door of Mr. Henderland's than, to my great surprise, he burst rudely past me, dashed into the room, caught up a jar and a small horn spoon, and began ladling snuff into his nose in excessive quantities. Then he had a hearty fit of sneezing, and looked round upon me with a rather silly smile.
"It's a vow I took upon me that I wouldn't carry it. Doubtless it's a great privation, but when I think upon the martyrs, not only to the Scottish Covenant, but to other points of Christianity, I think shame to mind it."
As soon as we had eaten, he took a grave face and said he had a duty to perform by Mr. Campbell to inquire into my state of mind towards God. I was inclined to smile at him, since the business of the snuff, but he had not spoken long before he brought the tears into my eyes. The next day, Mr. Henderland found for me a man who had a boat and was to cross the Linney Loch that afternoon into Appin, fishing. It was a dark sky, and the sun shining upon little patches. A little after we had started, the sun shone upon a moving clump of scarlet, some of the red soldiers coming into Appin against the poor tenantry. At the entering in of Loch Leven, I begged to be set on the shore under the wood of Lettermore in Alan's country. This was a wood of birches that overhung the loch. A bridle track ran through the midst of it, by the edge of which I sat down to eat some oat bread of Mr. Henderland's. As I was sitting and thinking, I saw 4 travellers come into view. The way was so narrow that they came single and led their horses by the reins. The first was a great red-headed gentleman of an imperious and flushed face, who carried his hat and fanned himself. The second, by his black garb and white wig, I took to be a lawyer. The third, a servant, wore part of his clothes in tartan, which showed his master was either an outlaw or in singular good odour with the government, since the wearing of tartan was against the act. If I had been better versed in these things, I would have known the tartan to be of the Argyle or Campbell colours. As for the fourth, I had seen his like before and knew him to be a sheriff's officer. For no reason that I can tell, when the first came alongside of me, I rose up from the bracken and asked him the way to Aucharn. He stopped and looked at me, as I thought, a little oddly, and then, turning to the lawyer, "Mungo," said he, "what many men would think this more of a warning than 2 piets? Here I am on my way to Duror on the job, you ken, and here is a young lad starts up and speers if I am on the way to Aucharn." "Glenure," said the other, "this is an ill subject for jesting." "And what seek you at Aucharn?" said Colin Roy Campbell of Glenure, him they called the Red Fox, for he it was that I'd stopped. "The man that lives there," said I. "James of the Glens. If you are concerned for me," said I am neither of his people than yours, but an honest subject of King George, owing no man and fearing no man." "Oh, why, very well said," replied the factor. "If you had asked me the way to the door of James Stewart on any other day but this, I would have set ye right and bidden ye Godspeed. But today, Mungo?" And he turned again to look at the lawyer. But just as he turned, there came the shot of a firelock from the hill, and Glenure fell upon the road. "Oh," I'm dead," he cried, several times over. The lawyer caught him up and held him in his arms, the servant standing over and clasping his hands. The wounded man looked from one to the other with scared eyes.
"Take care of yourselves. I am dead."
With that he gave a great sigh, his head rolled on his shoulder, and he passed away. I stood staring in a kind of horror. The sheriff's officer had run back at the first sound of the shot to hasten the coming of the soldiers. At last the lawyer laid down the dead man in his blood upon the road, and got to his feet with a kind of stagger. I believe it was his movement that brought me to my senses, for he had no sooner done so than I began to scramble up the hill, crying out, "The murderer! The murderer!" So little time had elapsed that when I got to the top of the first steepness, the murderer was still moving away at no great distance, and carried a long fowling piece. He was a big man in a black coat with metal buttons. "Here!" I cried. "I see him!" At that, the murderer gave a quick look over his shoulder and began to run. The next moment he was lost in a fringe of birches. I had been running and got a good way up when a voice cried upon me to stand. The lawyer and the sheriff's officer were waving on me to come back, and the redcoats, musket in hand, were beginning to struggle out of the lower wood.
£10 if you take the lad," cried the lawyer. "He's an accomplice."
At that word, which I could hear quite plainly, my heart came into my mouth. I was all amazed and helpless. The soldiers began to spread, some of them to run, and others to put up their pieces and cover me.
"Duck in here among the trees,"
said a voice close by. I scarce knew what I was doing, but I obeyed, and as I did so, I heard the firelocks bang and the balls whistle in the birches. Just inside the shelter of the trees, I found Alan Breck standing with a fishing rod. He gave me no salutation, only, "Come," and set off running along the side of the mountain towards Ballyhullish. Quarter of an hour later, Alan stopped, clapped down flat in the heather, and turned to me. "Now," said he, "it's earnest. Do as I do, for your life." And at the same speed, but with infinitely more precaution, we traced back across the mountainside, till at last Alan threw himself down where I had found him in the first, and lay panting like a dog. My own sides so ached, my head so swam, that I lay beside him like one dead. Alan was the first to come round. "Well, yon was a hot burst, David." I said nothing. I had seen murder done upon the man Alan hated. Here was Alan skulking in the trees and running from the troops. By my way of it, my only friend in wild country was blood guilty. I could not look upon his face. "Are you still wearied?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm not wearied now. You and me must twine. I liked you very well, but your ways are not mine, and are not God's." I will hardly twine from you, David, without some kind of reason for the same. If you ken anything against my reputation, you should let me hear the name of it." "Alan," said I, "what is the sense of this? You ken very well yon Campbell man lies in his blood upon the road." He was silent for a little, then looked at me mighty gravely. "I will tell you first of all, Mr. Balfour of Shaw's, as one friend to another, that if I were going to kill a gentleman, it would not be in mine own country, to bring trouble on my clan, and I would not go wanting sword and gun and with a long fishing rod upon my back." "Well," said I, "that's true. And now," continued Alan, taking out his dirk and laying his hand upon it in a certain manner, "I swear upon the holy iron I had neither art nor part, act nor thought in it." "I thank God for that," cried I, and offered him my hand, whereupon he gave me both of his, saying surely I had cast a spell on him, for he could forgive me anything. Then he grew very grave, and said we had not much time to throw away, but must both flee that country, because the whole of Appin would now be searched like a chamber, and everyone obliged to give a good account of himself. "Oh," says I have no fear of the justice of my country." "As if this was your country," said he. "Man, a whiles wonder at you. This is a Campbell that's been killed. Well, it'll be tried in Inverera, the Campbell's head place, with 15 Campbells in the jury box, and the biggest Campbell of them all, and that's the Duke, sitting talking on the bench. Justice, David, the same justice by all the world as Glenure found a while ago at the roadside." This frightened me a little, I confess, but still I cried out that he was unjust to the Duke of Argyll, who, for all he was a Whig, was yet a wise and honest nobleman. "Tut!" cried Alan. "The man's a Whig, nae doubt, but I would never deny he was a good chieftain to his clan.
And what would the clan think if there was a Campbell shot and nobody hanged and their own chief of the Justice General? But I've often observed that you low country bodies have no clear idea of what's right and wrong. At this I did at last laugh out loud. To my surprise, Alan joined in and laughed as merrily as myself. Nah, said he. We're in the Heelands, David, and when I tell you to run, take my word and run. No doubt it's a hard thing to skulk and starve in the heather, but it's harder yet to lie shackled in a redcoat prison.
I asked him whither we should flee, and as he told me to the lowlands, I was a little better inclined to go with him, for I was growing impatient to get back and have the upper hand of my uncle.
I'll chance it, Alan, said I. I'll go with you.
But mind you, said Alan, it's no small thing. You maun lie bare and hard and brook many an empty belly. I tell you this, for it's a life I ken well. But you either take to the heather with me, or else hang. And now let's take another keek at the redcoats. Looking out between the trees, we could see the waters of the loch, and away at the far end, wee red soldiers dipping up and down over the hill and how. Alan watched them, smiling to himself.
Aye, said he, they'll be gey weary before they've got to the end of that employ. So you and me, David, can sit down and eat a bite and breathe a bit and take a dram from a bottle. Then we'll strike for the house of my kinsman, James of the Glens, where I must get my clothes and my arms and money to carry us along. And then we'll cry, Forth, Fortune, and take a cast amongst the heather. So we sat and ate and drank. Partly as we sat, and partly afterwards, each of us narrated his adventures, and I shall here tell so much of Alan's as seems either curious or needful. It appears, as soon as the wave was past, he saw me and lost me as I tumbled in the roost, and at last had one glimpse of me clinging on the yard. This put him in some hope, and made him leave those messages that had brought me to that unlucky country of Appin. In the meanwhile, those still on the brig had got the skiff launched, when there came a second wave, greater than the first, and heaved the brig out of her place. The stern had hitherto been lowest, but now her stern was thrown in the air, and water began to pour in the forescuttle. It took the colour out of Alan's face even to tell what followed. There were still 2 men lying impotent in their bunks, and these began such harrowing cries that all on deck tumbled into the skiff and fell to their oars. They were not 200 yards away when there came a great sea, and the brig lifted clean over the reef. Her canvas filled for a moment, and she seemed to sail in chase of them. But presently she drew down and down as if a hand was drawing her, and the sea closed over the Covenant of Dysart. They had scarce set foot upon the beach when Hoseason woke up, as if out of a muse, and bade them lay hands upon Alan, crying that Alan was alone, that he had a great sum about him, and here was both revenge and wealth upon a single cast. And then, said Alan, the little man with the red head, Riach, said I. Aye, well, it was him took up clubs for me, asked the men if they weren't feared of a judgment, and he cried on me to run, and indeed I thought it was a good observe, and ran. The last that I saw, they were all in a knot upon the beach, like folk that were not agreeing very well together.
Night fell as we were walking, and though Alan pushed on with an assured manner, I could by no means see how he directed himself. At last, about 10:30 of the clock, we came to the top of a brae and saw lights below us. A house door stood open, and all round the house 5 or 6 persons were moving hurriedly about, each carrying a lighted brand.
James must have tint his wits, said Alan. If this was the soldiers instead of you and me, he would be in a bonny mess. But I dare say he'll have a sentry on the road, and would ken well enough no soldiers would find the way we came.
He whistled 3 times in a particular manner. At the first sound of it, all the moving torches came to a stand, as if the bearers were affrighted. At the third, the bustle began again as before. Having thus set folks' minds at rest, we came down the brae, and were met at the yard gate by a tall, handsome man of more than 50.
James Stewart, said Alan. Here is a young gentleman of the lowlands, but I'm thinking it will be the better for his health if we give his name the go-by.
James of the Glens greeted me courteously enough. He turned to Alan.
This has been a dreadful accident. It will bring trouble in the country.
Hoot, said Alan. Colin Roy is dead, and be thankful for that. Aye, and by my troth, I wish he was alive again. The accident fell out in Appin. Mind ye that, Alan. It's Appin that must pay, and I am a man that has a family.
While this was going on, I looked about me at the servants, Some were digging in the thatch of the house or the farm buildings from which they brought out guns, swords, and different weapons of war. Others carried them away. A lassie came out of the house carrying a bundle. "What's that the lassie has?" Alan asked. "We're just setting the house in order, Alan," said James, in his frightened and somewhat fawning way. "They'll search Appin with candles. We're digging the guns and swords into the moss, you see, and these will be your ain French clothes." "I bury my French clothes, troth no," and Alan laid hold upon the packet and retired into the barn to shift himself. I was then taken by one of the sons and given that change of clothing of which I had stood so long in need, and a pair of Highland brogues made of deer leather, very easy to the feet. By the time I came back, Alan must have told his story, for it seemed understood I was to fly with him. They gave each of us a sword and pistols, and with these and some ammunition, a bag of oatmeal, an iron pan, and a bottle of French brandy. Money indeed was lacking, Alan's belt having been dispatched by another hand, and as for James, he could only scrape together 3 and 5 halfpenny, the most of it in coppers. "This'll no do," said Alan. "You must find a safe bet somewhere nearby," said James, "and get word sent to me. You see, you'll have to get this business prettily off, Alan, but see here, I'll have to get a paper out against you myself. I'll have to offer a reward for you, you and your friend from the Lowlands. You see that, Alan? See that you see that." Alan flushed a bit. "Oh, this is unco hard on me that brought him here, James," said he. "It's like making me a traitor." "Alan, man, he'll be papered anyway. Mungo Campbell'll be sure to paper him. What matters if I paper him too? Alan, I'm a man that has a family, and it'll be a jury of Campbells." "There's one thing," said Alan. "Nobody kens his name." "Nor yet they shall nae. My hand on that," cried James, as if he had really known my name and was foregoing some advantage. Thereupon we said farewell and set out again, bending somewhat eastwards, in a fine mild night, and over much the same broken country as before. Sometimes we walked, sometimes ran, and as it drew on to morning, walked ever the less and ran the more. Day found us in a prodigious valley, strewn with rocks, and where ran a foaming river. Wild mountains stood around us. There grew neither grass nor trees, and I have sometimes thought since then that it may have been the valley called Glencoe, where the massacre was in the time of King William. The first peep of morning showed us this horrible place, and I could see Alan knit his brow. "This is no fit place for you and me," he said. "This is a place they're bound to watch." He set off running again, and when at last Alan paused under a great rock, it was none too soon for David Balfour. "A great rock," I said. By rights it was 2 rocks leaned together at the top, both some 20 feet high. Even Alan, though he had as good as 4 hands, failed twice in an attempt to climb them, and it was only by standing on my shoulders and leaping that he secured a lodgment. Once there, he let down his leather girdle, and I scrambled up. Then I saw why he had come there, for the 2 rocks, being both somewhat hollow at the top, made a kind of saucer where as many as 3 or 4 men might have lain hidden. The dawn had come quite clear. We could see the stony sides of the valley and its bottom bestrewed with rocks, and the river. About half a mile up the water was a camp of redcoats. A big fire blazed in their midst, at which some were cooking. All the way down along the riverside were posted sentries, here near together, here widely scattered. Higher up the glen, where the ground was more open, the chain of posts was continued by horse soldiers. "You see," said Alan, "this is what I was afraid of, that they would watch the burnside. We're in a narrow place. If they get up the sides of the hill, they could easily spy us with a glass. But if they'll only keep in the foot of the valley, we'll do yet. The posts are thinner down the water, and come night, we'll try our hand at getting by them." "And what are we to do till night?" I asked. "Lie here and burstle." That good Scotch word burstle was indeed the most of the story of that day we now had to pass. We lay in the bare rocks like scones upon a griddle. The sun beat upon us cruelly, and all the while we had no water, only a raw brandy for a drink, which was worse than nothing. The soldiers kept stirring all day, now changing guard, now in patrolling parties hunting amongst the rocks. We could see them pike their bayonets amongst the heather, and they would sometimes hang about our rock, so that we scarce dared to breathe. It was in this way that I first heard the right English speech, one fellow actually clapping his hand upon the sunny face of the rock and plucking it off again with an oath. "I'll tell you it's hot," said he. and I was amazed at the clipping tones and the odd sing-song in which he spoke, and no less at that strange trick of dropping out the letter H. The tediousness and pain of these hours upon the rock grew only the greater as the day went on, the rock getting still the hotter and the sun fiercer. There were giddiness and sickness and sharp pangs like rheumatism to be supported. At last, about 2, it was beyond men's bearing, and there was now temptation to resist. For the sun, being got a little into the west, there came a patch of shade on the east side of our rock, which was the side sheltered from the soldiers. "As well one death as another," said Alan, and slipped over the edge and dropped on the ground in the shadowy side. I followed him at once, and instantly fell all my length, so weak was I and so giddy with that long exposure. Here then we lay for an hour or 2, aching from head to foot, as weak as water. Presently we began to get a little strength, and Alan proposed we try a start. So we began to slip from rock to rock, now crawling flat on our bellies, now making a run for it, heart and mouth. The soldiers, being perhaps somewhat sleepy with the sultriness of the afternoon, had now laid by much of their vigilance, and stood dozing at their posts. But the business was the most wearing I had ever taken part in, for the afternoon was now fallen so breathless that the rolling of a pebble sounded abroad like a pistol shot. By sundown we had made some distance, and coming on a deep, rushing burn, we plunged head and shoulders in the water. Being wonderfully renewed, we got out the meal bag and made dramach in the iron pan, which is but cold water mingled with oatmeal. As soon as the shadow of the night had fallen, we set forth again with more boldness. The way was very intricate, so that I walked in continual fear of falling. The moon rose at last, and showed me many dark heads of mountains, and was reflected far underneath us on the narrow arm of a sea loch. Alan seemingly was well pleased, and he must have judged us out of earshot of all our enemies, for throughout the rest of the night march he beguiled the way with whistling of many tunes, warlike, merry, plaintive. Real tunes that made the foot go faster, tunes of my own south country that made me fain to be home from my adventures. Early, as day comes in the beginning of July, it was still dark when we reached our destination, a cleft in the head of a great mountain, with water running through the midst, and upon the one hand a shallow cave. Birches grew there in a thin, pretty wood, which further on changed into a wood of pines. The burn was full of trout. The name of the cleft was the Hugh of Corrinakiach, and although often beset with clouds, it was a pleasant place, and the 5 days we lived in it went happily. We were so bold as to make a fire, so that we could cook hot porridge and grill the little trouts that we caught with our hands under the stones and overhanging banks of the burn. With a rivalry that much amused us, we spent a great part of our days groping about, or as they say, guddling for these fish. In the meanwhile, you are not to suppose that we neglected our chief business, which was to get away. "We must get word sent to James," Alan said to me on our first morning, "and he must find the siller for us." "And how shall we send that word," said I, "unless ye get the fowls of the air to be your messengers?" "Aye," said Alan, "you're a man of small contrivance, David." Thereupon he fell into a muse, looking in the embers of the fire, and presently, getting a piece of wood, he fashioned it in a cross, the 4 ends of which he blackened on the coals. Then he looked at me a little shyly. "Could ye lend me my button? I owe it I am loath to cut another." I gave him the button, whereupon he strung it on a strip of his greatcoat which he had used to bind the cross, and tying it in a little sprig of birch and another of fir, he looked upon his work with satisfaction. "Now," said he, "there is a little clachan, what is called a hamlet in the English, not very far from Corrinakiach, and it is the name of Collisnacoan. There are living many friends of mine, and some that I am not so sure of. Being so, I would as lief they didn't see me. So, when it comes dark again, I will steal down and set this in the window of a good friend of mine, John Breck McCall, a bowman of Appins. And if he finds it, what is he to think? Well, I wish he was a man of more penetration, for by my troth I am afraid he will make little enough of it. But this cross is in the nature of the crostari, or fiery cross, which is the signal of gathering in our clans. Yet there it is, standing in his window, and no word with it. So he will say to himself, the clan is not to rise, but there is something. Then he will see my button that was Duncan Stewart's, and he'll say, the son of Duncan Stewart is in the heather, and has need of me. Well, said I, Even supposing so, there is a good deal of heather between here and the Forth. But, says Alan, when John Breck will see the birch and the pine, and he will say to himself, if he is a man of any penetration at all, which I misdoubt, Alan will be lying in a wood which is both of pines and birches. Then he will think to himself, that is not so very rife hereabout, and then he will come and give us a look up in Corrinakirch. Hey, man, says I, you're very ingenious, but would it not be simpler to write him a few words in black and white? That is an excellent observe, Mr. Balfour of Shaw's, said Alan, and it would certainly be much simpler for me to write him, but to John Breck, to read it, he would have to go to the school for 2-3 years, and it's possible we might be wearied waiting for him. So that night Alan carried down his fiery cross and set it in the bowman's window. About noon the next day a man was to be spied straggling up the open side of the mountain in the sun. He was a ragged, wild, bearded man of about 40, grossly disfigured with the smallpox, and looked both dull and savage. I thought he had little goodwill to serve us, and what he had was the child of terror. Alan would have had him carry a message to James, but he would hear of no message, and would have a letter or wash his hands of us. Alan searched the wood until he found the quill of a cushat dove, which he shaped into a pen, made a kind of ink with gunpowder and water from the stream, and tearing a corner from his French military commission, which he carried like a talisman to keep him from the gallows, wrote as follows: Dear kinsman, please send the money by the bearer to the place he kens of, your affectionate cousin A.S. The bowman promised to make what speed he best could. He was 3 full days gone, but in the evening of the 3rd we heard a whistling, which Alan answered. The bowman seemed well pleased to have got to the end of such a dangerous commission. He gave us news that the country was alive with redcoats, and that James was clapped in prison at Fort William. It was noised on all sides that Alan Breck had fired the shot, and there was a bill issued for both him and me with £100 reward. The little note from Mrs. Stewart was of miserable sadness. In it she besought Alan not to let himself be captured. The money she had sent was all she could beg or borrow, and lastly she enclosed one of the bills in which we were described. This we looked upon with great curiosity and not a little fear. Alan was advertised as a small, pock-marked, active man of 35 or thereby, dressed in a feathered hat and a French side-coat of blue, with silver buttons and lace a great deal tarnished. And I, as a tall, strong lad of about 18, wearing an old blue coat, very ragged. I was well enough pleased, for since I had changed these rags, the description had become a source of safety. Alan, said I, you should change your clothes. Na, troth, said Alan, I have nae others. A fine sight I would be if I went back to France in a bonnet. This put a second reflection in my mind, that if I were to separate from Alan and his tell-tale clothes, I should be safe against arrest. I thought of it all the more when the bowman brought out a green purse with 4 guineas in gold and the best part of another in small change. True, it was more than I had, but then Alan, with less than 5 guineas, had to get as far as France. I, with my less than 2, not beyond Queensferry. So that, taking things in their proportion, Alan's society was not only a peril to my life, but a burden on my purse. But there was no thought of the sort in the honest head of my companion. He believed he was serving, helping, and protecting me, and what could I do but hold my peace and take my chance of it? More than 11 hours of incessant hard travelling brought us to a low, broken desert land. A thin mist went up from the moorland like a smoke, so that, as Alan said, there might have been 20 squadron of dragoons there, and we none the wiser. David, said Alan, this is how we stand. Appin's fair death to us. To the south is all Campbell's, and no to be thought of. To the north, well, there's no muckle to be gained from going north, neither for you that wants to get to Queensferry, nor me that wants to get to France. Well then, we can strike east. East be it, said I, quite cheerily, but I was thinking, oh man, if you would only take one point of the compass and let me take another, it would be the best for both of us. East, you see, we have the muirs, said Alan. Let the redcoats come over the hill, they can spy on you miles away, and the sorrows in their horses' heels, they would soon ride you down. It's no good place, David. Alan, said I, Appin's death for us. We've none too much money, nor yet meal. It's all a risk, and I give my word to go ahead until we drop. Alan was delighted. "There are whiles when ye are altogether too Whiggish to be company for a gentleman like me, but there come other whiles when, David, I love ye like a brother." We went down accordingly into the waste and began to make our toilsome and devious travels towards the eastern verge. If I had guessed what it would be to crawl half the time upon my belly and to walk much of the rest stooped nearly to the knees, I should certainly have held back from such a killing enterprise. Toiling and resting and toiling again, we wore away the morning, and about noon lay down on a thick bush of heather to sleep. Alan took the first watch, and it seemed to me I had scarce closed my eyes before I was shaken up to take the second. But by this time I had the taste of sleep in my throat, my joints slept even when my mind was waking, and every now and again I would give a jump and find I had been dozing. The last time I woke I could have cried aloud, for I saw I had betrayed my trust, for sure enough a body of horse soldiers had come down during my sleep and were drawing near to us from the southeast, spread out in the shape of a fan, and riding their horses to and fro in the deep parts of the heather. When I waked Alan, he knitted his brows with a sudden quick look, both ugly and anxious, which was all the reproach I had of him. "We'll have to play at being hares," said he. "Do you see yon mountain? Its name is Ben Alder. If we can win to it before the morn, we may do yet." "But, Alan, that will take us across the very coming of the soldiers." "I ken that fine, but if we are driven back on Appin, we are two dead men. So now, David, be brisk." With that, he began to run forward on his hands and knees with an incredible swiftness, as though it were his natural way of going. This posture of running, the aching and faintness of my body, the labouring of my heart, had soon grown to be so unbearable that I begged we might lie down and sleep. "Alan," I said, "it's not the want of will, it's the strength that I want." "Very well then," said Alan, "I'll carry ye." I looked to see if he were jesting, but no, the little man was in dead earnest, and the sight of so much resolution shamed me. "Lead away," said I, "I'll follow." By what I have read in books, I think few that have held a pen were ever really wearied, or they would write of it more strongly. I had no care of my life, neither past nor future, and I scarce remembered there was such a lad as David Balfour. I did not think of myself, but just of each fresh step, which I was sure would be my last, with despair, and of Alan, who was the cause of it, with hatred. Day began to come in, after years, I thought, and by that time we were past the greatest danger, and could walk upon our feet like men. Alan must have been as stupid with weariness as myself, and looked as little where we were going, or we should not have walked into an ambush like blind men. It fell in this way. We were going down a heathery brae, Alan leading and I following a pace or two behind, like a fiddler and his wife, when 3 or 4 ragged men leaped out, and the next moment we were lying on our backs, each with a dirk at his throat. I don't think I cared. I was too glad to have stopped walking to mind about a dirk. The face of the man that held me was black with the sun, and his eyes were very light. But I was not afraid of him. I heard Alan and another whisper in Gaelic, and what they said was all one to me. Then the dirks were put up, and we were set face to face, sitting in the heather. "They are Clooney's men," said Alan. "We couldna have fallen better. We're just to bide here till they get word to the chief of my arrival." Now, Clooney Macpherson, the chief of the clan Vurich, had been one of the leaders of the great rebellion 6 years before, and I had supposed him long ago in France. Even tired as I was, the surprise half wakened me. "What?" I cried. "Is Clooney still here?" "Aye, he is so, still in his own country and kept by his own clan. King George can do no more." I would have asked further, but Alan gave me the put off. "I'm rather wearied," he said, and rolled in his face in a deep heather bush, and seemed to sleep at once. There was no such thing possible for me. I had no sooner closed my eyes than my body, and above all my head, belly, and wrists, seemed to be filled with whirring grasshoppers. That was all the rest I had until the messenger returned, when, as it appeared that Clooney would be glad to receive us, we must get once more upon our feet and set forward. I felt a kind of dreadful lightness, which would not suffer me to walk. I drifted like a gossamer. I could have wept at my own helplessness. I saw Alan knitting his brows at me, and supposed it was in anger. I remembered too that I was smiling, and could not stop smiling, But my good companion had nothing in his mind but kindness, and the next moment 2 of the gillies had me by the arms, and I began to be carried forward with great swiftness through a labyrinth of dreary glens and hollows, and into the heart of that dismal mountain of Ben Alder. Quite at the top, we found that strange house which was known in the country as Clooney's Cage. A tree which grew out from the hillside was the living centre-beam of the roof. The walls were of wattle and covered with moss. It half hung, half stood in that steep hillside thicket, like a wasp's nest in a green hawthorn. Within, it was large enough to shelter 5 or 6 persons with some comfort. A projection of the cliff had been cunningly employed to be the fireplace. When we came to the door, Clooney was seated by his rock chimney, watching a gillie about some cookery. He was mighty plainly habited, with a knitted nightcap drawn over his ears, and smoked a foul cutty pipe. For all that, he'd the manners of a king, and it was quite a sight to see him rise out of his place to welcome us.
"Well, Mr. Stewart, come awa, sir," said he, "and bring in your friend that as yet I dinna ken the name of." "And how is yourself, Clooney?" said Allen. "I hope you do brawly, sir. And I'm proud to see ye and to present ye to my friend, the Laird of Shaw's, Mr. David Balfour." Allen never referred to my estate without a touch of a sneer when we were alone, but with strangers he rang the words out like a herald. "Step in by the both of ye, gentlemen," said Clooney. "I make ye welcome to my house, which is a queer, rude place for certain, but one where I have entertained a royal personage, Mr. Stewart. Ye doubtless ken the personage I have in my eye. We'll take a dram for luck. My life is a bit dreich," says he, pouring out the brandy. "I see little company. I sit and twirl my thumbs and mind upon a great day we all hope will be upon the road. And so here's a toast to ye, the Restoration." Thereupon we all touched glasses and drank. I'm sure I wished no ill to King George, and if he had been there himself in proper person, it's like he would have done as I did. No sooner had I taken out the dram than I felt hugely better, and could look on and listen no longer with the same distress of mind. Clooney bade us in to our meal, but I could eat but little. All the while Clooney entertained us with stories of Prince Charlie's stay in the cage, giving us the very words of the speakers, and rising from his place to show us where they stood. By these I gathered the prince was a gracious, spirited boy, like the son of a race of polite kings, but not so wise as Solomon. I gathered, too, that while he was in the cage he was often drunk, so the fault that has since, by all accounts, made such a wreck of him had even then begun to show itself. We were no sooner done eating than Clooney brought out an old, thumbed, greasy pack of cards, such as you might find in a mean inn, and his eyes brightened in his face as he proposed that we should fall to playing. Now, this was one of the things I had been brought up to eschew, like disgrace. It being held by my father neither the part of a Christian nor yet a gentleman to set his own livelihood and fish for that of others on the cast of painted pasteboard. To be sure, I might have pleaded my fatigue, but I thought it behoved me that I should bear a testimony. I must have got very red in the face, but I spoke steadily. Clooney stopped mingling the cards. "What in deil's name is this?" said he. "What kind of Whiggish canting talk is this for the house of Clooney Macpherson?" "I will put my hand in the fire for Mr. Balfour," says Allen. "He is an honest and a mettled gentleman, and I would have ye bear in mind who says it. I bear a king's name, and I and any that I call friend are company for the best. But the gentleman is tired and should sleep. If he has no mind to cartes, it will never hinder you and me, and I'm fit and willing, sir, to play at any game that you can name." I had no will that these two friends should cut their throats for my sake. "Sir," said I am very wearied, as Allen says, and what's more, as you are a man that likely has sons of his own, I may tell you it was a promise to my father." Say nae mair, said Clooney, and pointed me to a bed of heather in a corner of the cage. For all that, he looked at me askance, and indeed it must be owned that both my scruples and my words smacked somewhat of the Covenanter, and were little in their place among wild Highland Jacobites. What with the brandy and the venison, I had scarce lain down upon my bed before I fell into a kind of trance, in which I continued almost the whole time of our stay in the cage. I was conscious only of a general black, abiding horror, a horror of the place I was in, and the plaids on the wall, and the voices and myself. Allen and Clooney were most of the time at the cards. Allen must have begun by winning, for I remember a great glittering pile of 60 or 100 guineas on the table. The luck, it seems, changed on the second day.
About noon I was awakened for my dinner, and as usual refused to eat, and was given a dram with some bitter infusion. Clooney sat at the table, biting the pack of cards. Alan had stooped over the bed, and had his face close to my eyes, to which, troubled as they were with the fever, it seemed of the most shocking bigness. He asked me for a loan of my money. "What for?" said I. "I don't see." "Had, David, you wouldn't grudge me a loan." I would, though, if I had had my senses. But all I thought of then was to get his face away, and I handed him my money. On the third day I awoke with a great relief of spirits, very weak and weary indeed, but seeing things of the right size. I sat in a dream all morning, only disturbed by the passing by of Clooney's scouts and servants, coming with provisions and reports. He and Alan had laid the cards aside and were questioning a gillie. The chief turned to me and spoke. "My scout report all clear in the south, and the question is, have you the strength to go?" I saw cards on the table, but no gold, only a heap of little written papers, and I began to have a strong misgiving. "I do not know if I am as well as I should be," said I, looking at Alan, "but the little money we have is a long way to carry us." Alan took his underlip into his mouth. "David," says he at last, "I've lost it. There's the naked truth." "My money too?" "Your money too. I'm daft when I get to the cards." "Hut, hut, hut, hut," said Clooney. "It was all daffing. Of course you'll have your money back again, and the double of it. It's not to be supposed that I would be any hindrance to gentlemen in your situation," and began to pull gold out of his pockets with a mighty red face. "Will you step to the door with me, sir?" said I. Clooney said he would be very glad, but he looked flustered. "And now, sir," says I must first acknowledge your generosity." "Nonsense, nonsense," cried Clooney. "Where's the generosity? What would you have me do, boxed up in this beascape of a cage? But just set my friends to the cards, and if they lose, it's not to be supposed—" "Yes," said I, "if they lose, you give them back their money, and if they win, they carry away yours. But to me, sir, it's a very painful thing to be placed in this position." Clooney said nothing. All the time he grew redder and redder in the face. "I'm a young man," said I. "Advise me as you would your son. My friend fairly lost his money after having fairly gained a far greater sum of yours. Can I accept it back again? Whatever I do, it must be hard upon a man of any pride. So you see, sir, there is something to be said upon my side, and this gambling is a very poor employ for gentlefolks. I'm sure that if ever Clooney hated any man, it was David Balfour. The more credit that he took it as he did." "Mr. Balfour," said he, "I think you are too nice and covenanting, but you have the spirit of a very pretty gentleman. Upon my honest word, you may take this money. It's what I would tell my son. And there's my hand along with it." Alan and I were put across Loch Errocht under cloud of night, and went down its eastern shore, led by one of the gillies from the cage. For long we said nothing, I angry and proud, Alan angry and ashamed. Ashamed he had lost my money, angry that I should take it so ill. At last he could bear it no longer. "David, this is no way for two friends to take a small accident. I'm sorry, and so that's said. Now, if you've anything, you'd better say it." "Oh," says I have nothing." He seemed disconcerted, at which I was meanly pleased. "No, but when I say I was to blame—" "Why, of course you were to blame, and you will bear me out that I have never reproached you." "Never," says he, "but you ken very well that you've done worse. I will only say this to you, that I have long been owing you my life, and now I owe you money. You should try to make that burden light for me." We fell back into our former silence, and came to our journey's end, and supped, and lay down to sleep without another word. The gillie put us across Loch Rannoch in the dusk of the next day, and gave his opinion as to our best route. We set forth, and for the best part of 3 nights travelled on eerie mountains and among the wellheads of wild rivers, often buried in mist, almost continually blown and rained upon. By day we lay and slept in the drenching heather, by night incessantly clambering upon breakneck hills and among rude crags. A fire was never to be thought of. Our only food was drammach and a portion of cold meat we had carried from the cage, and as for drink, heaven knows we had no want of water. During all these horrid wanderings we had no familiarity. The truth is that I was sickening for my grave, which is my best excuse. But besides that, I was now incensed both against my companion and myself. For the best part of 2 days he was unweariedly kind. For the same length of time I stayed in myself, nursing my anger. The peep of the third day found us upon a very open hill, so that we could not follow our usual plan and lie down immediately to eat and sleep. Alan, looking in my face, showed some marks of concern. "You had better let me take your pack," said he, for perhaps the 9th time since we had parted from the scout. "I do very well, I thank you," said I, as cold as ice. Alan flushed darkly. "I'll not offer it again. I'm not a patient man, David." "I never said you were," said I, which was exactly the rude, silly speech of a boy of 10. Alan made no answer, but his conduct answered for him. He cocked his hat again, walked jauntily, whistled airs, and looked at me upon one side with a provoking smile. The third night we were to pass through the country of Balquhidder. I was dead weary, deadly sick, and full of pains and shiverings. In this poor state I had to bear from my companion something in the nature of a persecution. He spoke a good deal, and never without a taunt. Whig was the best name he had to give me. All the while I was growing worse and worse. At last I began to feel that I could trail myself no further, and with that there came on me the wish to have it out with Alan, and be done with my life in a more sudden manner. He just called me Whig. I stopped. "Mr. Stewart," said I, "you are older than I am, and should know your manners. Do you think it either very wise or very witty to cast my politics in my teeth? I thought where folk differed, it was the part of gentlemen to differ civilly. But it's time these manners ceased, and I mean you shall henceforth speak civilly of my king and my good friends the Campbells." "I am a Stuart," began Alan. "Oh, I ken you bear a king's name, but since I've been in the Highlands I've seen a good many that bear it, and the best I can say of them is, they would be none the worse of washing." "Do you know that you insult me?" Alan stood quite still, the tails of his greatcoat clapping behind him in the wind. "There are things said that cannot be passed over." "I never asked you to," said I. "I am as ready as yourself," and drawing my sword, I fell on guard. "David!" he cried, "are you daft?" And he stood for a moment, wringing his mouth in his hand. He drew his sword, but before I could touch his blade with mine, he had thrown it from him and fallen to the ground. "Nah, nah," he kept saying. I cannae. At this my anger oozed all out of me, and I found myself only sick and sorry and blank. I minded me of all Alan's kindness in the past, how he had helped and cheered and borne with me in our evil days. At the same time, the sickness seemed to redouble. "Alan," I said, "if you cannae help me, I must just die here." He started up and looked at me. "This last hour my legs have been fainting under me. I've a stitch in my side like a red-hot iron. I cannot breathe right. If I die, you'll forgive me, Alan." "Wheesht, wheesht," cried Alan. "Dinna say that. Davy, I'm no a right man at all. I couldn't remember that you were just a bairn. I couldn't see you were dying in your feet. Davy, you'll have to try and forgive me." "Oh, man, let's say no more about it," said I. "Oh, but my stitch is sore. Is there nae house?" "I'll find a house for you, David. We'll follow the burn. There's bound to be houses. My poor man, will you no be better than my back?" "Oh, Alan," says I, "and me a good 12 inches taller." "Ah, you're no such thing. There may be a trifling matter of an inch or two. I'm not saying I'm what you would call a tall man, whatever. And I dare say, when I come to think of it, I dare say you'll be just about right. Aye, it'll be a foot, or near hand, or maybe even mair." It was sweet to hear Alan eat his words up in the fear of some fresh quarrel. I could have laughed, but if I had, I think I must have wept too. At the first house we came to, Alan knocked, which was no very safe enterprise in the braes of Balquhidder. No great clan held rule here. It was filled and disputed by small septs and broken remnants. Here were Stuarts and MacLarens, which came to the same thing, for the MacLarens followed Alan's chief in war. Here too were many red-handed MacGregors. They had always been ill-considered, and now worse than ever, having credit with no side in the whole country of Scotland. Chance served us very well, for it was a household of MacLarens we found, where Alan was known by reputation. I was got to bed, and a doctor fetched, who found me in a sorry plight. Whether because he was a good doctor, or I, a young, strong man, I lay bedridden for no more than a week, and before a month I was able to make the road again with a good heart. All this time, Alan hid by day in a hole of the braes, and at night, when the coast was clear, would come to visit me. Mrs. McLaren thought nothing good enough for such a guest, and as Duncan Dhu, our host, had a pair of pipes in his house, we commonly turned night into day. The soldiers let us be, although once 2 companies and some dragoons went by in the bottom of the valley. There was but one thing happened worth narrating, the visit I had of Robin Oig, one of the sons of Rob Roy. He was sought upon all sides, yet he stepped about Balquhidder like a gentleman in his own walled policy. He came in with a great show of civility to my bedside and bowed. "I'm given to know, sir, that your name is Balfour." "They call me David Balfour," said I, "at your service," and I sat up and bowed in bed, for I thought best to compliment him. He bowed in return. "What I'm come to say, sir, is this. In the year 45, the surgeon that cured my brother's leg when it was broken in the brush at Preston Pans was brother to Balfour of Baith. And if you are one of that gentleman's kin, I've come to put myself and my people at your command. You're to remember that I knew no more of my descent than any cadger's dog, and there was nothing left but the bitter disgrace of owning that I could not tell. Robin told me shortly that he was sorry he had put himself about, turned his back up on me without a sign of salutation, and went toward the door. Just in the door, he met Alan coming in, and the 2 drew back like strange dogs. "Mr. Stewart, I'm thinking," said Robin. "Troth, Mr. MacGregor, it's not a name to be ashamed of," answered Alan. "I did not know you were in my country, sir." "It sticks in my mind that I am in the country of my friends, the McLarens," said Alan. "That's a kittle point," returned the other. "But I think I will have heard that you are a man of your sort." "Unless you were born deaf, Mr. MacGregor, you will have heard a good deal more than that. I am not the only man that can draw steel in Appin, and when my kinsman Art Shiel had a talk with a gentleman of your name, I could never hear that the MacGregor had the best of it." "Do you mean my father, sir? My father was an old man. The match was unequal. You and me make a better pair, sir." "I was thinking that," said Alan. It was a case of now or never, and Duncan, with something of a white face to be sure, thrust himself between. "Gentlemen," said he, I will have been thinking of a very different matter, whatever. Here are my pipes, and here are you 2 gentlemen who are both acclaimed pipers. It's an old dispute which one of you's the best. Here will be a broad chance to settle it." "Why, sir," said Alan, still addressing Robin, "I think I've heard some soch of the sort. Have you the music, as folk say?" "I can pipe like a MacCrimmon," cried Robin. "And that is a very bold word," quoth Alan. Duncan Dhu made haste to bring out the pair of pipes that was his principal possession, and to set before his guests a mutton ham and a bottle of Athol Brose, which is made of old whisky, strained honey, and sweet cream. The 2 enemies sat, one upon each side of the peat fire. Each ate a small portion of ham and drank a glass of brose to Mrs. McLaren. And then, after a great number of civilities, Robin took the pipes and played a little spring. "Hi, you can blow," said Alan, and taking the instrument he played the same spring, which as he went on he decorated with grace notes, such as pipers call the warblers. I had been pleased with Robin's playing. Alan's ravished me. "That's no very bad, Mr. Stewart," said the rival, "but you show a poor device in your warblers." "Me?" cried Alan. "I give you the lie." "Do you own yourself beaten at the pipes, then? What do you seek to change them for the sword?" "And that's very well said, Mr. MacGregor," returned Alan. "And in the meantime I take back the lie. I appeal to Duncan." "Indeed you need appeal to nobody," said Robin. "You're a far better judge than any McLaren in Balquhidder, for it's God's truth that you're a very creditable piper for a Stewart. Hand me the pipes." Alan did as he asked. "And now be the judge yourself, Mr. Stewart," said Robin, and taking up the variations from the beginning, he worked them throughout to so new a purpose that I was amazed to hear him. As for Alan, he sat like a man under some deep affront. "Enough," he cried. "You can blow the pipes. Make the most of that." And he made to rise. But Robin only held out his hand as if to ask for silence, and struck into the slow measure of a pibroch. It was a fine piece of music in itself, and nobly played. But it seems, besides, it was a piece peculiar to the Appin Stewarts, and a chief favourite with Alan. The first notes were scarce out before there came a change in his face. "Robin Oig," he said, when it was done, "you are a great piper. I am not fit to blow in the same kingdom with ye. Body of me, you have more music in your sporran than I have in my head." Thereupon the quarrel was made up, All night long the brose was going and the pipes changing hands, and the day had come pretty bright before Robin as much as thought upon the road. It was the last I saw of him, for I was in the Low Countries at the University of Leyden when he stood his trial and was hanged in the grass market. The month was not yet out, but it was already far through August when I was pronounced able for my journey. Our money was now run to so low an ebb that we must think first on speed, for if we came not soon to Mr. Rankeeler's, or if, when we came there, he should fail to help me, we must surely starve. Accordingly, we pushed to the house of a MacLaren in Strathire, a friend of Duncan's, where we slept the 21st of the month. The 22nd we struck Allan Water, and coming to the edge of the hills, saw the whole Carse of Stirling underfoot, with the town and castle, and the moon shining on the links of Forth. "Now," said Allan, "you're in your own land again. We passed the Heelan line in the first hour, and if we could but pass yon crooked water, we might cast our bonnets in the air." As soon as dusk began to fall, we struck for the bridge of Stirling, close under the castle hill, an old, high, narrow bridge with pinnacles along the parapet, and you may conceive with how much interest I looked upon it, not only as a place famous in history, but as the very doors of salvation to Allan and myself. I was for pushing straight across, but Allan was more wary, so we lay for about a quarter of an hour. At last there came by an old hobbling woman with a crutch stick. We soon lost sight of her, only heard the sound of her steps and her stick. Then, "Who goes?" cried a voice, and we heard the butt of a musket rattle on the stones. "This'll never do," said Allan. "This'll never, never do for us, David." And without another word he began to crawl away through the fields. All night we walked through the north side of the Carse under the Ochil Mountains, and about 10 in the morning, mighty hungry and tired, came to the little clachan of lime kilns that looks across the Hope to the town of Queensferry. There was Mr. Rankeeler's house on the south shore, where I had no doubt wealth awaited me, and here was I upon the north, clad in poor enough attire of an outlandish fashion, with 3 silver shillings left to me, a price upon my head, and an outlawed man for my sole company. In Limekilns we entered a change house and bought some bread and cheese. This we carried in a bundle, meaning to eat it on the seashore. Allan had fallen into a muse. At last he stopped in the way. "Did you take heed of the lass we bought this off?" says he, tapping the bread and cheese. "To be sure," said I, "and a bonny lass she was." "You thought that? That's good news. I want her to be sorry for you, David. Let me see. I wish you were paler, but you have a fine hangdog clapper macaw kind of a look to you. Come, right about, and back to the change house." As we got near, he made me take his arm and hang upon it like one almost helpless with weariness. The maid appeared surprised, as well she might be, at our speedy return. But Allan had no words to spare for her in explanation, helped me to a chair, called for a tass of brandy, which he fed me in little sips, and then, breaking up the bread and cheese, helped me to eat it like a nursery lass. It was small wonder if the maid were taken with a picture of a poor, sick, overwrought lad and his tender comrade. "What's wrong with him?" said she at last. Allan turned upon her with a kind of fury. "Wrong?" cries he. "He's walked more hundreds of miles than he has hairs upon his chin, and slept oftener in wet heather than dry sheets. Wrong, quoth she. Wrong enough, I would think." "He's young for the like of that." "How young?" said Allan. "It would be better riding," says she. "And where could I get a horse to him?" cried Allan. "Would you have me steal?" "You needn't tell me," said she at last. "You're gentry." "Well," said Allan, "and suppose we were?" "Has he nae friends?" "That has he so," cried Allan. "If we could but win to them, friends and rich friends, and here he must tramp in the dubs and sleep in the heather like a beggared man." "And why that?" says the lass. "My dear, I canna very safely say, but I'll whistle ye a bit of tune." And with that, in a mere breath of a whistle, he gave her a few bars of "Charlie is my darling." "Wheesht," says she, and looked over her shoulder to the door. "And him so young." "He's old enough to," and Allan struck his forefinger in the back part of his neck, meaning that I was old enough to lose my head. "It would be a black shame," she cried, flushing high. "Poor lamb." And she touched me on the shoulder with a little friendly touch, as much as to bid me cheer up. "Look here, my lass," said Alan. "There are boats in the kingdom of Fife, for I saw two upon the beach by your town's end. Now, if we could have the use of a boat to pass under the cloud of night into Lothian, there would be 2 souls saved, mine to all likelihood, his to a dead surety. If we lack that boat, we have but 3 shillings left in this wide world, and where to go, and what other place there is for us except the chains of a gibbet. I give you my naked word, I kenna." I could see the lass was in great trouble of mind, being tempted to help us, and yet in some fear she might be helping malefactors, so now I determined to step in myself. "Did you ever hear," said I, "of Mr. Rankeeler of the ferry?" "Rankeeler the writer," said she. "I dare say that." "Well, it's to his door that I'm bound, so you may judge by that if I'm an ill-doer." Her face cleared up mightily at this. "That's more than I would ask. Mr. Rankeeler is a Kent man. You can trust me. I'll find some mean to put you over." At this we shook hands with her and set forth as far as to the wood. Here we must lie all day, concealed in a thicket. The night fell quiet and clear. Lights came out in houses, and then, one after another, began to be put out. It was past 11 before we heard the grinding of oars upon the rowing pins, and saw the lass herself coming to us in a boat. She had trusted no one with her affairs, but left the house by a window, stole a neighbour's boat, and came to our assistance single-handed. I was abashed how to find expression for my thanks, and so, what with one thing and another, she had set us on the Lothian shore and was out at sea again before there was one word said either of her service or our gratitude. After she was gone, Alan stood a great while upon the shore, shaking his head. "Ah, it is a very fine lass, David. It is a very fine lass." The next day it was agreed Alan should fend for himself, but as soon as it began to grow dark, he should lie in the fields near to Newhalls and stir for naught until he heard me whistling. I was in Queensferry before the sun was up. It was a fairly built borough, the houses of good stone, many slated. It put me to shame for my foul tatters. As the morning went on, people began to appear out of the houses. I continued to walk up and down, and saw people looking askance at me. For the life of me I could not muster the courage to address any of these reputable burghers. It grew to be perhaps 9 in the forenoon. I was worn with these wanderings, and chanced to have stopped in front of a very good house with beautiful clear glass windows, when there issued forth a shrewd, ruddy, consequential man in well-powdered wig and spectacles. This gentleman was so much struck by my poor appearance that he came straight up to me and asked me what I did. I told him I was on business, and asked him to direct me to the house of Mr. Rankeeler. "Why," says he, "that is his house that I have just come out of, and I am that very man." "Then, sir, I have to beg the favour of an interview. My name is David Balfour." "David Balfour? And where have you come from, Mr. David Balfour?" "From a great many strange places, sir," said I, "but I think it would be as well to tell you where and how in a more private manner." "Yes," says he, "that would be for the best, no doubt." And he led me back with him into his house and into a little dusty chamber full of books and documents. "And now," says he, "pray come swiftly to the point. Nec gemino bellum Trojanum orditur ab ovo. Do you understand that?" "I will do as Horace says, sir," I answered, smiling. "And careo in medias res." He nodded. His scrap of Latin had been set to test me. "I have reason to believe myself some rights on the estate of Shaws." He got a paper book out of a drawer and set it before him, open. "Mr. Balfour, where were you born?" "In Essendine, sir. The year 1734, the 12th of March. "Your father and mother?" "My father was Alexander Balfour, schoolmaster of that place, and my mother Grace Petaro, from Angus." "Have you any papers proving your identity?" "They are in the hands of Mr. Campbell, the minister, and could be readily produced." "Did you ever meet a man of the name of Hoseason?" "I did, sir. It was by his means and by my uncle I was kidnapped, carried to sea, suffered shipwreck and other hardships, and stand before you today in this poor accoutrement." "The brig was lost on June the 27th, says he. "We are now at August the 24th. Here is a considerable hiatus, Mr. Balfour, of near on 2 months. "Indeed, sir," said I, "these months are very easily filled up, but before I told my story, I would be glad to know that I was talking to a friend. You're not to forget, sir, that I was shipped off to be a slave by the very man that, if I rightly understand, is your employer." At this sally, which I made with something of a smile, He laughed out loud. "No, no, fui non sum. I was your uncle's man of business, but while you were custodo remoto on the very day of your sea disaster, Mr. Campbell stalked into my office demanding you from all the winds. Mr. Ebenezer admitted having seen you, declared he had given you considerable sums, and that you'd started for the continent of Europe, intending to fulfill your education. Further interrogated, he so much disrelished some expression of mine that, in a word, he showed me the door. In comes Captain Hoseason with a story of your drowning, whereupon all fell through with another blot in your uncle's character, which could ill afford it. And now, Mr. Balfour, you can trust for yourself to what extent I may be trusted." "Sir," said I, "if I tell you my story, I must commit a friend's life to your discretion. Pass me your word it shall be sacred, and I will ask no better guarantee than just your face." He passed me his word very seriously. "But," said he, "I would beg you to bear in mind I am a lawyer." Thereupon I told him my story, he listening with his spectacles thrust up and his eyes closed, so that I sometimes feared he was asleep. Yet when I called Alan Breck, we had an odd scene. The name of Alan had of course rung through Scotland with the news of the Appin murder. "I would name no unnecessary names, Mr. Balfour," said he, "above all of Highlanders. I'm somewhat dull of hearing, and am far from sure I caught the name exactly. Well, call your friend, if you please, Mr. Thompson." James Stewart, in like manner, was Mr. Thompson's kinsman, Colin Campbell a Mr. Glenn, and to Clooney I gave the name of Mr. Jameson, a Highland chief. "Well, well," said the lawyer when I'd done, "this is a great epic, a great odyssey of yours. Mr. Thompson seems to me a gentleman of some choice qualities, though perhaps a trifle bloody-minded. But you're doubtless right to adhere to him. Indubitably he adhered to you. Well, well, these days are fortunately by, and speaking humanly, you are near the end of your trouble." He rose, called over the stair to lay another plate for Mr. Balfour would stay to dinner, and led me into a bedroom. Here he set before me water and soap and a comb, and laid out some clothes that belonged to his son. I made what change I could in my appearance. When I'd done, Mr. Rankeeler caught me on the stair, made me his compliments, and had me again into the cabinet. "You'll be wondering, no doubt, about your father and uncle. To be sure, it is a singular tale, for the matter hinges on a love affair. Your uncle, Mr. David, was not always old. He had a fine, gallant air, and a spirit of his own that seemed to promise great things. In 1715, what must he do but run away to join the rebels? It was your father that pursued him, found him in a ditch, and brought him back multum gementem. However, the two lads fell in love, and with the same lady. She was no fool. It's from her you must inherit your good sense, and refused to be banded from one to the other. Both got upon their knees to her, and she showed both of them the door. However, the end of it was that from concession to concession on your father's part, they came at last to drive a sort of a bargain, from whose ill results you have recently been smarting. The one man took the lady, the other the estate. Your father and mother lived and died poor folk, and in the meanwhile, what a time it has been for the tenants on the estate of Shaw's." "Well, sir," said I, "and in all this, what is my position?" "Well, the estate is yours beyond a doubt, but your uncle is a man to fight the indefensible, and if any of your doings with Mr. Thompson were to come out, we might find we had burnt our fingers. The kidnapping, to be sure, would be a court card upon our side, if we could prove it." "The great affair," I asked, "is to bring home to him the kidnapping?" "Surely," said Mr. Rankeeler, "and if possible out of court." "Well, sir," said I, "here is my way of it," and I opened my plot to him. "This would involve my meeting the man Thompson," cries he, rubbing his brow. "No, Mr. David, I say nothing against Mr. Thompson. I know nothing against him, and if I did, mark this, it would be my duty to lay hands on him." "You must be the judge, sir," said I, but it was clear my plan had taken hold upon his fancy. We were called to dinner in the company of Mrs. Rankeeler, and that lady had scarce left us to ourselves and a bottle of wine ere he set to work, writing, and had his clerk into the chamber. "Torrance," said he, "I must have this written out fair against tonight. When it is done, you'll be so kind as to put on your hat and be ready to come along with this gentleman and me, for you will probably be wanted as a witness." Towards the time I had appointed with Alan, we set out from the house, Mr. Rankeeler and I arm in arm, and Torrance following behind. At last we were clear of the houses when, upon a sudden, Mr. Rankeeler cried out, clapped his hand to his pockets, and began to laugh. "Oh, why is this not a farcical adventure? After all that, I've forgotten my glasses." As soon as we were past the hawse, I went up the hill whistling a Gallic air, and had the pleasure to see Alan rise from behind a bush. I told him the part I looked him to play, and waved upon Mr. Rankeeler. "Mr. Thompson, I'm pleased to meet you, but I have forgotten my glasses. Mr. David here will tell you that I am a little better than blind, and you must not be surprised if I pass you by tomorrow." This he said, thinking Alan would be pleased, but the Highlander's vanity was ready to startle at less than that. "Why, sir," said he, "I would say it mattered the less, as we are met here for a particular end, to see justice done to Mr. Balfour, but I accept your apology, which was a very proper one to make." Night had quite come when we came in view of the house of Shaw's. The lawyer, Torrance, and I crept down beside the corner of the house, and Alan strode to the door and began to knock. For some time Alan volleyed upon the door. At last I could hear a window gently thrust up. "What's this? What brings you here? I have a blunderbuss." "Is that yourself, Mr. Balfour? Have a care with that blunderbuss. They're nasty things to burst. But what brings me here is David. Shall I give the rest of the name?" "I'm thinking I'd better let you in," said my uncle. "I dare say that," said Alan, "but I'm thinking it is here upon the doorstep we must confer." Well, what must be must." It took him a long time to get downstairs. At last my uncle slipped gingerly out. "Mind I have the blunderbuss. Now you can name your business." "Why," said Alan, "you will have perceived that I am a Hieland gentleman. The county of my friends is no very far from the Isle of Mull. It seems there was a ship lost in those parts, and the next day a gentleman of my family came upon a lad that was half drowned. Well, he brought him to, and clapped him in an old ruined castle, where he has been a great expense to my friends. And finding the lad was your born nephew, Mr. Balfour, they asked me to give you a bit call. My friends are no very well off." "Nah," said my uncle. "I take nae manner of interest in the lad, and I'll pay nae ransom." "I was thinking that, Mr. Balfour," replied Alan. "By all that I could hear, there were two ways. Either you liked David and would pay to get him back, or else you had very good reasons for not wanting him." "Didn't he follow you there?" "No," said Alan. "Well, see here. You didn't want the lad back. Well, what do you want done with him? And how much will you pay? Troth, sir, I ask for nothing but plain dealing. In 2 words, do you want the lad killed or kept?" "Oh, keep it, wailed my uncle. I will have nae bloodshed." "Well," says Alan, "as you please. That'll be the dearer. And now about the price. It's no very easy for me to set a name upon it. I would have to ken, for instance, of what you gave Hoseason at the first off-go." "Hoseason? What for?" "Well, for kidnapping David." "It's a lee! It's a black lee!" cried my uncle. "He was never kidnapped. What do you mean? Did Hoseason tell you that?" "Why, you doddard old runt, how else would I ken? Hoseason and I are partners. We gang shares, so you can see for yourself what good you can do leeing. The point in hand is just this. What did you pay him?" "Has he told you himself?" "That's my concern," said Alan. "Well," said my uncle, "I didn't care what he said. He leed, and the solemn God's truth is that I gave him £20. But I'll be perfectly honest with you, for by that he was to have the selling of the lad in Carolini. Whilk would be as muckle mair, but no from my pocket, you see." "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That will do excellently well," said the lawyer, stepping forward, and then, mighty civilly, "Good evening, Mr. Balfour," said he. "And good evening, Uncle Ebenezer," said I. "And it's a braw nicht, Mr. Balfour," added Torrance. Never a word said by my uncle, but stared upon us like a man turned to stone. Alan filched away his blunderbuss, and the lawyer, taking him by the arm, led him into the kitchen, where the fire was out and only a rushlight burning. "Oh, come, Mr. Ebenezer," said the lawyer. "You must not be downhearted. I promise you we shall make easy terms." We had the fire lighted, a bottle of wine uncorked, to which Torrance and I and Alan set ourselves down, while the lawyer and my uncle passed into the next chamber to consult. They stayed there about an hour, at the end of which period they had come to a good understanding, and my uncle and I set our hands to the agreement. By the terms of this, my uncle bound himself to pay me 2 clear thirds of the yearly income of Shaw's. So the beggar in the ballad had come home, and when I lay down that night, I was a man of means and had a name in the country. But this good change in my case unmanned me more than any of the former evil ones, and I lay till dawn, looking at the fire and planning the future. I had come to port, but I still had Alan, to whom I was so much beholden, on my hands. I unbosomed to Rankeeler next day. About my clear duty to my friend, the lawyer had no doubt. I must help him out of the country. He wrote a letter, making comments on it as he wrote. This is to my bankers, the British Linen Company, placing a credit to your name. Mr. Thompson will know of ways, and you, with this credit, can supply the means. I trust you will be a good husband of your money, but in the affairs of a friend like Mr. Thompson, I will be even prodigal. Thereupon he took his farewell and set out for the ferry, while Alan and I turned our faces for the city of Edinburgh. We came the byway over the hill of Corstorphine, and when we got near the place called Rest and Be Thankful, he repeated what had been agreed on between us, the daily hour at which Alan might be found, and the signals that were to be made by any seeking him. Well, goodbye, said Alan, and held out his left hand. Goodbye, said I, gave the hand a little grasp, and went off down the hill. Neither of us looked the other in the face, nor did I take one back glance at the friend I was leaving. But as I went on my way to the city, I felt so lost and lonesome that I could have found it in my heart to sit down and cry and weep like any baby. It was coming near noon when I passed in by the West Kirk. I let the crowd carry me to and fro, and yet all the time there was a cold gnawing in my inside, like a remorse for something wrong. The hand of Providence had brought me in my drifting to the very doors of the British Linen Company's bank.